Cob is a stone that is popular all over the world, minerals of blue color, but it is very widespread, especially when it is understood that when cleaning, it became one of the best and most efficient sources of energy in the world. But over time, all the reserves that existed in all countries of the world began to slowly run out, and eventually ran out. Many countries around the world tried to get what was left of him, and all this happened on lands that did not belong to anyone. But over time, everything became more and more complicated. Then a great war began. Even when several years passed, the end of this war was not in sight at all. The most powerful country that ever existed was called Tristan. It used unusual weapons on the battlefield. This weapon was created using the modifications of the mechanical form of the lives of the Koba nation. But as always in any history in the world, there was only a small number of such living weapons that could change the world and turn it upside down. This was called the weapon of Genesis. It was so valuable and rare. But suddenly unwanted people appeared on the battlefield. Very suddenly they created chaos. They did not know the will. They were so strong that no weapon of any kind could affect them. But only one creature could win on countless battlefields that seemed endless. But some time after all this, there were talks about the need to start a war and make peace. People all over the world who were too tired of the hopeless war began to rejoice and live their lives without fear of what could happen tomorrow, or even in a minute. This country, which was able to do what they could not do for several years in a row, ended a very long and brutal war. She also received the right to command the deposits of this city, which was located on lands that did not belong to anyone. At that time, the number of people who began to praise and thank the creators of the Genesis weapon increased in the city of Tristan. But outside this garden, a very large number of people thought that this weapon was very dangerous and affirmed that it should be disposed of as soon as possible. Chaos reigned in the world. People ran for their lives and tried to help those whom it would seem impossible to help. Suddenly, the man began to faint. Everything began to become blurred in his eyes, and the sounds began to seem thunder or a knife. In fact, the man understood what was happening. He really did not want it. But in the distance he saw a black silhouette that was visible in the smoke. When the young man realized what was happening, he whispered sorry for not being able to save his friend. But suddenly the boy woke up and realized that it was just a terrible dream. He was lying on the bed and did not understand what had happened. Then the boy sat down more comfortably, and his mood became worse because these nightmares haunted him almost every night. He sat on the edge of the bed and realized that it was that dream again. Then he realized that something important was being said on the radio. The radio said that they announced very important news that day. Drones developed by the M3 company would be delivered throughout the country. Then they said that the goal was to increase security by increasing the skills of police officers, who were then in very small numbers, and also said that the drones used during the war were improved for greater security. The development of this design, namely a dangerous weapon, was produced by a company that the young man did not have time to hear because he decided to turn off the radio. The young man decided to gather himself. He put on a quilted jacket and decided to go outside. Suddenly, the young man was walking on the street past a workshop that was repairing everything and heard other people talking about something. When he entered the store, he saw there a girl with red and short hair who breathed a sigh of relief. But she did not see him yet because she was standing with her back to the entrance. Suddenly, he asked the girl to go home and be his acquaintance, whose name was Cindry, and the girl noticed him and was surprised that he woke up on time. The young man ignored her question and decided to ask his own. He asked if she had started something bad like last time, but it seemed to him that she was doing well. Suddenly the girl laughed, covering herself with her hand, and said that she had already worked there for 3 years and it was enough to worry about her that day. She had a lot of work, she was a little tired. The young man asked how she was working, why she answered that everything was fine, she already understood those things. The young man asked the girl to go home already because she had worked well. Instead, the girl comfortably sat down on a chair and said that she would not go because she had no one to talk to at home anyway, so she decided to sit for a while and then leave. Instead, the young man stood with his back to her and said that if she had nothing to do, then let her clean up, and all the things she used were not in her cities. Instead, the girl replied that she left them in order to clean up later and added that he should not touch them because she could do everything herself. But Odie started to get angry with her because she had already said that several times and in the end didn't clean anything. But Cindry pretended that she didn't hear anything. The girl decided to quickly change the subject of the conversation and asked if Sunbi had heard anything. She told that about the deployment of drones guarding the entire country and asked if he had heard about it or not. The young man answered briefly, clearly that they were talking about it on the radio. The girl turned to the boy and added that no matter what, people became completely stupid because it was the same drones that were used in the war, not the same bloody and long war. If they hadn't improved those drones, they would have killed hundreds of thousands of people, and they didn't even care. Instead, during the conversation, the young man collected all the things that the girl did not put on her cities and listened to her instead. She continued that other people think that everything will be fine if they are made where the main weapon of Genesis is. Suddenly, everything flashed before the eyes of the young man, as if he was not in his head, and all this was happening to him. Instead, the girl who was sitting on the chair with folded hands did not even move, but she heard the characteristic sound of the object breaking. Instead, the young man stood with his back to her and did not speak. Then the girl awkwardly turned to him and asked if something had happened or if something had broken. But then the young man realized what he did. He did it subconsciously, as it seemed to him at first glance, but it turned out that he really broke the object. Then, without addressing her, he remained standing with his back and replied that he simply remembered not very pleasant past times. The girl immediately fell into shock and, turning to him, asked for forgiveness. She did not want to remind him of the terrible thing that was already behind. But the guy replied that it's okay because he didn't calculate his strength, and apologized for scaring the girl. But she replied with a smile that everything was fine, she wasn't scared. Then she asked if he would go investigate again after work, to which he replied that of course he would. The girl got up, turned to him, looked at him carefully, told him to be very careful, although she constantly repeated it. The monk added with a smile what he would mean and thanked her for these words because he was pleased that someone cared about him. The girl was already leaving the house and added that everything would be fine with him, and she was going home, while the young man replied that they would see each other tomorrow. Then the young man came to the table and saw the same scattered things that the girl never cleaned up, although she promised that she would, but it turned out as usual, so he will have to clean them up. He once again took a look at all the things and realized that it was time to start because the work was unfinished. The city of Tristan, in which there were two races, namely the mechanical race of Koba and ordinary people. This is a country that was created in a very large warship whose origin was unknown to anyone. It always remained a mystery. This city was headed by the M3 Corporation. It was she who developed many drones, transport vehicles and very scary but powerful combat weapons. It was they who 3 years ago put an end to this long and bloody war, which seemed like it could last forever, and they became the strongest state that no other country can cross. The young man was walking and did not understand where he needed to go because he was there for the first time and did not understand the area. Namely, this ordinary young man, who is unusual in general, he was one of this first race, which was called Koba. He also lived in that city. Suddenly, the young man heard a conversation that he needed to hear, strangers talking about what those drones that were presented at that time, and why they were distributed in that way. The conversation continued and one man said that he had heard that recently it was possible to see Cobb in the form of a Titan very often. The other did not believe these words and asked if reincarnation into that form had already become a crime in itself. Instead, the young man followed these men and began to listen more carefully to their conversation. One of them said that this is why they scattered those drones around to somehow receive them, which the other man confirmed because those drones were military from the very beginning, but not for the form of Titans. The form of the Titan was another form of the Cobra race, but due to the danger of this mutation or transformation in the city, it was banned. The young man listened to those men so much that when he saw the time on his phone, he realized that he was very late. So he decided to quickly pass those men and pick up his pace, since Odie was in that city repairing machinery, and those drones everyone was talking about. Every night, in the cities that were outside the field of vision of the famous M3, the young man provided free repairs to people who could not afford it, and who had very limited wealth. He worked every day outside until dawn, much harder than he could have imagined. But he had another real reason to go out every night, and help others no matter what. It was already late at night when people were doing a security check and trying to reach everything at once. One man invited another to check everything, but Dad replied that they finished everything and managed in time. Then these men got into the car and agreed that for that time it was enough and they could finish on any other day, so they decided to go back instead. The other man agreed to this while Odie was listening to this conversation by the car. He stood so that he could not be seen and listened carefully to this conversation, not understanding what they were talking about. The men decided to go, and on the way, when they were going, one of them asked to go more carefully so that things don't fall, but the other one apologized and corrected his mistake. Instead, they had already approached the factory that manufactured weapons. It was the main one in the city of M3. The men drove into the garage, which is specially designed for cars that belong to this plant, and parked the car, turning it off. When the young man made sure that the two men left the car and got out, he got out of the trunk of the car and managed to hide while the men were talking. Odie carefully jumped out of the car so that no one heard him, but so that he did not fall and touch anything. He realized that it was good that he managed to get in, so it was time to move on with his plan. Meanwhile, a young man and a girl were running along the dark and black corridors. They were running with all their might, as if running away from someone or something. Then the young man saw in front of him, and told his companion that they had finally arrived. They finally got to the big gate that was the exit that led to the garbage dump. The guy started to explain what was behind that door, and before he could finish he coughed. Instead, the girl got scared and asked if Marco was feeling well. Suddenly, they realized in the conversation that he couldn't open that door, but there was someone standing with him who told them to just surrender. Suddenly they realized that they were caught. The young man was angry at everything, and the girl was frightened and did not know what to do. The army that caught them warned them not to say goodbye, but instead they stood together at a distance, and shouted so that those scum wouldn't come near them. The completely bald man realized that they would not be able to come to an agreement, so he began to call someone, but without a phone, putting 2 fingers to his ear. But suddenly they realized that he didn't call anyone at all and turned into a completely different being. He then asked them to surrender kindly and return to their nest. Meanwhile, the young man sat at the computer in the archive and tried to do what he planned. He got into another computer to look and find Guinness's weapon, but when he started the search, the computer showed no search results. The young man got very angry and hit the table with his fist out of rage. He didn't even understand how it happened. He had already managed to go around all 20 M3 factories. Didn't he need all these factories, but the main office? At that time, a bald man who turned to another creature informed the others that the target was found near the door leading to the garbage dump. He ordered to block all exits and leave immediately. It was this conversation that the young man heard through the wall, and did not understand what kind of stick they were talking about. He began to continue his search and typed quickly on the keyboard. He thought that why there was so little security. Probably because they were all in another city because something had happened. Continuing his search, he thought that something so big could happen, or that all the guards were there and not where Odie was. Suddenly he heard some sounds and did not understand where they were coming from. At that time, since the girl and the boy decided not to surrender so easily to the hands of these monsters, they failed because they beat them well. One of them kept the girl at a distance, the other killed her friend. He did not feel sorry for him and did everything he thought he deserved. Instead, the girl stood looking at them in horror and screamed and tried to somehow help, and the young man was lying on the floor and could not get up. Instead, the bald man, who was quite a man, said that if he had obeyed them, they would not have had to beat him. One of them said that it was necessary to notify the superiors that they had finally caught those children. Why, he replied that he would notify. Instead, the girl screamed and tried to escape from the clutches of that terrible monster, but she did not succeed at all. But she did not give up hope for salvation. Instead, some steps were heard, which no one understood from where and who could be walking. Everyone turned their attention to the place from where the steps were heard. Even the young man who was lying on the floor and could get up raised his head to see who had come. It was Odie who came to the sounds of that girl's screams to see what happened there, and what he could do to help. Suddenly, those monsters discussed who it could be, but the other answered that it was most likely an employee of their factory. Suddenly, the young man saw that those monsters were holding the girl and looking at him, anger wrapped around his neck like a boa constrictor. The girl looked at the young man with hope in her eyes and tears and wordlessly begged for help. Marco, on the other hand, was lying on the floor unable to get up because he was beaten so badly that he could not even breathe. Suddenly he saw that at that time this man or some other creature approached him and asked who he was and how he got there in the first place. Instead, the creature did not even have time to finish how the young man hit him so much that he flew back a couple of meters. Everyone was very surprised by this. The girl even stopped crying, and she had hoped that they would be saved. Instead, one of the people of a different race ordered the others to hold the girl better so that she could not escape, and he decided to ask the young man once again how he entered the factory. Instead, the young man warned with undisguised confidence in his eyes and gestures that he and only he would ask the question, and asked what they were doing there with those children. They stood and silently looked at the young man, shocked by what was happening. Instead, Marco regained consciousness and decided to act. He tried to scream for help and begged for it. Instead, the creature came to Marco and took him by the hair and answered that the young man was very funny and he didn't understand why he needed to answer. But it was already too late because from his words the boy had already seen so much. For several minutes they stood and looked at each other, and then in one moment the young man began to transform and realized that no one answered him anyway, so he began to act. In one small and short moment, not a young man stood in front of them, but something else. Those people became afraid of him and pointed all their weapons at him. They were shocked that that scumbag could do that was what they thought and feared. It turned out that it was exactly what they were thinking about. It was the form of a titan. The young man turned and walked straight at them with confidence and all his strength. He asked what those fools were afraid of, so he ordered to shoot the young man and not to waste a moment thinking. In a short moment, they started shooting at the young man while holding the girl and the boy close to them and preventing them from escaping. But for the titan form, those bullets were nothing. He stubbornly continued to walk and began to crush those creatures like seeds. In one moment, the creature that shot at him appeared underground from the power of the titan's form. The guy did not waste a minute. He was so fast and skillful that it was difficult to catch him. He beat almost the entire army that was in front of him. It seemed that there was only one left standing in front of him. He was shocked because of what he did. Odie decided to set conditions. They had to let the children go, or it was what happened to the others. Instead, the creature ordered the rest of the troops to kill him, and not stand around the city wasting minutes. Instead, it was not a problem for the young man to beat a few more creatures because they deserved what happened to him. They fought for a long time and the rest of the troops began to tire. But for the young man it was like an easy warm-up. Fighting back from the others, he did not notice that there was someone behind him, but he felt it, so he hit his enemy with his elbow. Then he decided to finish him off by hitting him on the head with his fist, which made him fall so that he punched the ground with his head. The one creature that remained stood in front of him. He was shocked and decided to ask if he didn't know that such transformations were a crime. Odie repeated what he had already repeated approaching the last one. He ordered for the last time to leave the children, or what happened to his other colleagues would happen to him. While another guy was running down the corridor and approaching the elevator, he stood in front of the guard and breathlessly asked a question. After a few minutes, he came to himself and asked the question more clearly. He asked if the owner Ellen was in his city, why the guard answered that he was inside. He said he had a message for this host, and the door to Ellen's office opened before him. Instead, what he saw in front of him when the door opened shocked him. He was shocked by what he saw in front of him. All the guards and all the creatures of the Cobra race were beaten and killed. Blood was everywhere. Instead, this master of the office sat half in the shade and asked what message he had for him. His hands were completely covered in blood. The owner asked if he wanted to inform him about the break-in. He already knew about it. Then the young man got scared. He raised his hands to the face of the host, who was not there, because it was not a person, but a creature from the race of Cobra. He asked if he had decided to tell him about it. Odie helped free the children. When they left, he decided to ask if there were other children in that factory. Which brand the guy was carrying on his shoulders. He replied that there was no one else there. Only the two of them. The guy was glad to hear it. In his mind, he could not understand for what purpose these children were kept in the factory where weapons were manufactured, so he decided that first it was necessary to get the children out of there, and then he would return again. Then he said that at first the most important thing was for them to free themselves and get out of there, so they decided to go to the devices that the girl who was next to them was carrying. Did not understand what those devices were, so she decided to ask. The guy began to tell that it was a special system that was used quite often in factories. He said that it was necessary to use them now because probably all the exits were already blocked. They decided to run very fast and run away from there. The girl was running next to them and the young man was carrying the boy on his shoulders. he decided to ask who he was, to which he replied that he was the one who was strong enough to kill all those people in one fell swoop. Then he realized that he was saying a little wrong for the children because they were not yet mature enough, and decided to correct himself, and said that he was an ordinary repairman and that was all. The girl and the boy did not understand what had happened, so they exchanged strange looks at each other. Odie said that it was necessary to look around where they had already been, and the girl wanted to help him with anything, so she offered her help. They were standing in the middle of the road and the young man asked the girl if she had any suggestions for his help. In response, the girl asked the young man a question asking if he knows what the devices they are going to look like. He began to tell that it was such a mechanism in the form of a column to which scanners in the shape of donuts were attached. Suddenly, the girl closed her eyes and repeated the words that he said to the aces of the columns to which scanners in the form of donuts were attached. Then the same blue sparkles, the same as her eyes, began to appear near her eyes. The young man thought to himself that this was quite good because she possessed the cybermetric. Odie was shocked by what he saw in front of him. He stopped, and stood looking at the girl without looking away. The boy who was on his shoulders answered that it was an ability that appeared in Lua after the modification. Odie could not understand what that ability was. This ability of Lua was called cybermetric. She could expand her field of vision and gain access to the nearest hiding place. Holding the boy in his arms, Odie decided to clarify whether it was definitely a modification, but the boy remained silent in response. Which city was so secret precisely because there was a very large number of experiments on a large number of children. After those experiments, the children had strange abilities, but the others could not stand it all. The boy did not say how it all ended because it was scary and unpleasant for him to understand it. But Odie decided to negotiate for the boy. He assumed that only he and the girl survived. Meanwhile, the girl continued to search for what she was asked to find. She could not do it quickly, but she tried to speed up. Suddenly, she opened her eyes a little and realized that they hurt. She began to quickly rub them with her hands, and sparkles the color of the sky flew around her. Suddenly the young man asked if everything was fine or he started to worry about her why the girl replied that everything was fine. Her eyes just hurt a little after she used her ability. Covering one voice, she replied that she had found the device the young man was talking about. He was surprised that she still found this device, so he asked her to lead them to him, to which the girl happily replied that she was able to lead. The boy who sat all this time on Oda's shoulders looked at his friend and winked at her with one eye. The girl looked at him with a smile. At that time, the owner and boss tried to extract information that the young man who came to his office wanted to tell him. When he confirmed that he wanted to tell about the fact that unknown people entered the factory, the owner rubbed his chin and thought. The boss replied that the boy should understand that the situation was so serious that it was impossible to allow those creatures to be found outside their factory. He gave us threats saying that if he didn't want to end up like those who were in front of him who were lying on the floor not breathing, he had to deal with everything that was happening. The boy lowered his eyes and looked at his ear, which was covered in blood, and realized that he did not want such a fate, so he agreed to learn about everything he needed. Then the owner asked if they were tracking his position in real time, to which the young man replied that they were doing it. Then the owner stood up and said that he would go there himself, so he asked to prepare a device that was transported to another city. Meanwhile, Odie and the children were almost at the target. They went out to the corridor and were met by security. The guards without words rushed at the boy and a battle began, which ended in a bad way for them. As it was already clear, they lost quickly and the guy didn't even put much effort into it. Suddenly, another guard answered on the walkie-talkie that something had to be done because he was all alone and there were many of them and those fools couldn't do anything to him. But it was not difficult at all for the boy. He continued to crush everything in his path with calm confidence. The head of the guards did not understand what they were doing at all, because there were so many of them against him alone. But the other answered that no weapon could take anything from him. Suddenly, he did not have time to return, as a beam that knocked down everything in its path hit him, killing one guard. Suddenly, the guard decided to reach for his gun in order to have time to shoot the boy at that moment. But he didn't have time to reach him, as Odie guard was already standing in front of him. He understood what would happen to him now, so he called him a monster. Then he decided to ask if he knew that such a form of reincarnation was a crime at all. Well, the boy answered so as not to make him laugh because it was really funny to say just that instead of begging for mercy. He decided to ask if it was really a crime while they were experimenting on children, and killing them because what he was doing was not a crime at all. Instead, the guard managed to pull out a gun at that moment, and aimed it at him, and shouted for him to get away as soon as possible. But he didn't have time to finish when the guy hit him and knocked him to the ground. It happened so fast that he didn't even blink an eye. He then transformed into his normal form and breathed a sigh of relief as he watched it all. Turning a little, he told the children to go out. Marco and Lua came out of their cover. The girl and the boy went out and walked past the corpses that were lying there, as if they had lost their lives a long time ago. The girl led the boy holding her hand because he was still not feeling well. The girl asked her friend if he was all right. He replied that he could already go. He tried to do it himself. Instead, Odie looked at them and understood that at that very moment the form of a titan was enough for him to deal with all that. So he decided that he would not have to change to another form. He asked the girl if there was still far to go to the device that was being transported to another city. Why, she replied that there was still a little left. They had almost reached it. Odie asked if there were still rivals with them, to which the girl replied that of course there were, and they were chasing them. The girl reported that they were chasing them and would be there in 5 minutes. The young man was surprised that they would be there in 5 minutes. How could the girl know such clear measurements of time? Therefore, they decided that they need to hurry very quickly and need to go so that they do not have time to catch up or to gain a little more time. When you got out of the police station, Marco noticed a gun on the floor and looked at it. Then an idea came to him. He asked his girlfriend to wait for him. The girl did not understand that he asked for what he wanted, that he planned that moment, so she turned to him, so she understood that they were looking at him. The young man took the gun and gave it to his girlfriend and told her to take it just in case. The girl was afraid but stretched out her hand to take it. Lua was holding a gun in her hands, and the young man replied that he needed to have at least one weapon with him with which they could defend themselves. The girl asked what he would do without a weapon. The boy replied that he had the power and, holding his hand, replied that he could use it at least once. But the girl did not understand what she needed to answer and looked at him in surprise. During the conversation, Odie interrupted them and decided to ask in which direction they needed to go, right or left, but the girl replied that everything was going right and they had quite a bit left. Odie walked from the front and the children hurried with him because they had slightly shorter steps than him, so they tried to keep up with him. The guy opened the fabric that was with the daughter-in-law to see what she was hiding behind her, whether they were going in the right direction or not. When they got to the middle, they realized that they were still going in the right direction. Then they reached the device that they needed from the very beginning. The children stood and looked at this device in surprise, studying it with their eyes. But the boy behind them closed the door so that no one would understand that someone had come there. He asked the children to wait a little because he needed to set the coordinates. So he stood behind the panel and began to enter the exact coordinates of where they needed to move. Suddenly, the machine started working and gave off a light pink-violet radiation that indicated that everything was going in the right direction. Instead, Marco looked at it very observantly, and he could not understand what it reminded him of, and he decided to take a closer look. Instead, a beam of pink light cut through the air and pushed the children back a little with its power. Odie could not understand what was happening, but he did not press the button that would have started the shipment. The children were watching this car very carefully when the smoke from the power of this beam dissipated a little, but instead they saw that a man came out of this smoke and said that it was he who he expected. It was the owner who had already overtaken them and was waiting for them there. He asked how things were going in Oda. The young man looked at him very surprised, not understanding that he really saw him in front of his eyes. Instead, the man came closer and spoke to him once more. The young man quickly realized who was standing in front of him. It seemed to him that it was another nightmare dream that he had every night. But no, it was actually Elent. At first, the boy did not understand how he ended up there. Elent stood and looked at him from afar, surrounded by smoke. Instead, the man with purple hair who was standing in front of the young man answered that he was simply removing the risk factors that were his duties because he was the responsible face of the factory. If he was a burglar who came to the factory, then of course most of the guards were killed. He could not understand what they were doing, so he decided to ask his interlocutor directly. Ellen began to go down the stairs to him to get closer to his interlocutor. He did not want to talk about what they were doing at this factory, but he began to start a conversation on another topic. When he got closer, he saw a boy standing and looking at him. He quickly turned his head in that direction. Marco began to protect his friend and stood in front of her, covering her with his hand. The girl stood and was afraid. Suddenly, a man with purple hair and green eyes whose name was Ellen realized who was standing in front of him. He was shocked by what he saw because he did not expect them to be there. But suddenly Marco began to feel something rub against his temple and he did not understand what had happened. But something was completely wrong. He was not well. It became after the man looked at him. Suddenly he grabbed his head and he started having a severe headache that he could not control. He could not stand still. The girl saw him and began to worry about him and asked if he was all right. He remembered that when they were experimenting on him, he realized that this face and this particular man was very familiar to him. When one of the experiments was conducted on him, he was in a cocoon that was filled with liquid. When he opened his eyes a little, he saw Ellen in front of him, who was standing among other people and watching him. Suddenly Marco fully understood and his hopes were confirmed. He began to shout that it was the man who conducted experiments on them, on all the children who were there, who survived and who did not survive. Most of them were no longer alive. Odie was shocked by what he heard from Marco. Anger appeared in him instantly. He clenched his fists and, of course, looked at the man standing in front of him. Suddenly Elin said that if he was the criminal, that is, Odie, the situation was changing very much. He did not hide his smile. But the boy could not understand what he was talking about, why it was changing the situation, and in which direction it could change it for the better or for the worse, but surely the answer lay on the surface. Elin decided to offer the boys to return to their city, that is, to M3 as the main weapon of Genesis. Then he added that someone else would be very happy to see him at that time. Suddenly the girls spoke and assumed that the weapon of Genesis was a weapon that was developed in the city of M3. Marco finished this sentence for her. So the girl turned to her savior and began to speculate while Elin stood and stared fixedly into Odie's eyes. The girl made an assumption that the guy who saved them could possibly be on the same side as the man who was standing in front of them. Elin began to approach the boy and said that 3 of their weapons had disappeared, which meant that the other weapons were also alive somewhere, but it was unknown where. Approaching even closer to the young man, he said with a smile that something would have happened if he had not disappeared from their factory when they needed him. Then Ellen added that they would not have needed to create such an imitation then, and at that moment he looked at the children who stood opposite. This made Marco very angry. He could not understand why they were addressing him in this way, because he could do something. When Ellen came even closer to his interlocutor, Odie decided to speak directly and openly so that everything would be clear from the first time. Suddenly, he warned that he was never going to return to that vile city in which he had been before, so he warned him to leave immediately and as quickly as possible from them. Suddenly, Ellen said that he had already assumed that they would not be able to come to an agreement, so he pulled out a big stinger from the cache. Odie could not understand what was happening. It was so fast that the eye did not have time to follow his movements. At that time Elin threw a stinger that flew as if asleep and cut the air with its sharpness. Marco could not understand what was happening and where the weapon was directed, which had already covered the distance to its target. In a moment, a sting pierced Marco's stomach and he bled. He stood and looked at this so-called weapon in his stomach and could not calm down from the shock that befell him. Ellen stood and with a smile admired the work he had done at that time. Marco fell to his knees and coughed, gasping for breath from the shock. The girl got scared and ran to the boy, holding him so that he would not fall completely. Odie was shocked by what happened. He became even more angry and asked why he did it, to which Ellen replied that he should think again about the offer he gave him earlier. The guy could not find the words to answer his interlocutor because he knew that if he said something wrong, Ellen could also advise Lua. Suddenly Ellen answered that if he wanted to save the life of Mark and the girl who was next to him, he should have simply agreed to the conditions that his husband had offered him a few minutes earlier. Then he said that these children were modified only because he, that is, Odie, disappeared a long time ago. Marco could not hold back his screams and the tears that rolled down his cheeks. The pain grew with every minute and became unbearable. Suddenly, these conditions enraged the young man, and his eyes lit up with green fire, and he added that he thought about human life in general. Instead, this creature stood calmly and radiated self-confidence, an incredible calm with a smile on its face as it decided to match its so-called companion. Suddenly, unexpectedly for no one, Ellen was shot from a gun, and the bullets flew away from his face, and all 3 gold pieces hit the floor. It was Lua who was standing next to her friend with a gun, her face radiating anger and eyes at the same time. But suddenly Marco began to worry about his girlfriend, who tried to protect him because he understood that these bullets would not have done anything fatal to Ellen. Elena only managed to raise her hand and rub the spot on her face where the bullet hit. Suddenly, he became angry, not for a joke, and out of nowhere another sting came into his hand, which he held to punish the girl who hit him. He could not understand how she even dared to do such a thing. But the girl did not lose her courage, and hoped that she would be able to kill him with a gun, and started shooting at him even harder and more often. But Ellen, with an enviable grace, was able to deftly dodge the shots or repel them with her iron hands. With a threat, he threw the sting into the place where there were children, who hugged and turned away from him out of fear. But before the sting reached the children, Odd intervened and covered the children with himself to protect and save their lives once again. He deflected this sting with his hand. It scattered into 1,000 or more small parts. Thereby he managed to save the children from certain death, which was inevitable a few seconds ago. When Ellen saw this, he was even a little disturbed by what he saw. The guy ordered the girl to take her friend and go to the device that could move them to a safe place. He could deal with it himself. He needed it. Ellen explained that that is, Odd was also one of the weapons of Genesis. But he was different from past rivals. The girl picked up the stamp and started to walk when suddenly she saw a wound on the boy's hand and began to worry about it. But the boy became more confident and, without turning to the children so as not to lose sight of his rival, replied that everything was fine with him and the girl had nothing to worry about. After a few seconds, he realized that the children were standing behind him, so he decided to shout at them to get out of there as quickly as possible and save their lives. Suddenly, the girl seemed to come to her senses and began to perceive the situation coldly, so she replied that they would immediately get out of there. Suddenly, the children began to leave and move away, and the rivals faced each other and realized that the battle promised to be hot. First of all, Ellen didn't want to let the children go as much as possible to get out of there alive, so he threw his weapon in their direction. But suddenly, when he looked up, he saw that he did not succeed in kissing the children, because the boy managed to catch him. He held this weapon over them and tried to rush them because he couldn't hold him back for long because he was quite strong. Suddenly, the children quickly began to walk and run away from there. Instead, Odie, holding this stinging weapon in his hands, broke it into 2 parts. When the boy threw away the remnants left by that weapon, he began to take off his coat, and the thought occurred to him that he did not know how much longer he could hold on to the energy he had left. Suddenly, he turned into a completely different being, from which sparks came out, as if from the god of thunder, which were of a sky-blue color. At that time he realized that there was no time for thinking at all. Suddenly, when he jumped up, it felt as if he had been struck by lightning, because the force spread throughout the room in which they were, and Ellen stood and watched this spectacle. The children did not have time to reach the exit when the stones and dust raised by Odie flew at them. When he stood in front of Ellen, showing himself in all his glory, Ellen smiled at him. This smile indicated all the impudence and confidence he felt. The guy turned into a completely different creature. He was in the form of a titan, namely in the mode of the ruler. Suddenly, when the girl saw it, she froze for one short moment, then realized that she had heard about that form before. The girl said that the reincarnation that was available was only the weapon of Genesis, namely the other face of the form of the titan. Ellen began to approach him and said that he had not seen the ruler's regime for a long time. It reminded him of old memories of how he and Odie used to fight together. When he got into a fighting position, he assumed that even before it seemed to him that Odd was enjoying himself. Or maybe it just seemed to him from the outside. When Odie looked at his hand and lowered his head, he really wondered if it did not bring him pleasure. But for a moment silhouettes and pictures from the past popped into his head of those people who in panic tried to escape and save their lives and the lives of their relatives. He remembered the great bloody war that he had to survive, how many people he killed who deserved what happened to them. But there were others who were innocent who died because they got into the wrong moment at the wrong time. Suddenly, he jumped out of his memories, pounced on his opponent with all his strength. He answered him that there were memories for him that he could not remember. Suddenly, the beam of power Odie gave flew at the speed of sound, destroying everything in its path. It even lifted the floor. The boy hit the wall, which cracked under the force of his weapon and left a dent on it, which will constantly remind of the events that took place that day and what consequences they brought. He also took aim at his opponent, who told him that he had become much weaker than before. Perhaps it was precisely because his energy was already running out. These words seemed to hurt the young man. He did not want to admit it to him, so he decided to shut him up once and for all. Suddenly Ellen, who turned into a robot with a large snake tail, it was also the form of a titan, but the mode of a viper. Then he calmly climbed onto it, keeping himself in the air due to this. He decided that he would arrest them all together because he had no other choice or did not want to consider other options. The children who still left were shocked by what they saw, because they had not seen it before, but only Lua was shocked, who was holding Marco, who was almost unconscious. Ellen began to crawl on his tail like a real viper, slowly but surely approaching them closer and closer. Suddenly, his tentacles, which were more like sharp and red wasp stings, began to surround Odie. Having managed to react in time, he ran out of that trap. He began to gain speed to approach Ellen quickly and without hesitation. But since Ellen had a long snake tail, he climbed on it and managed to escape from the blow of his opponent and decided to answer him with the same. But Odd was still faster than his opponent, so he managed to strike first directly at Ellen's snake tail, making a wound there and crushing it a little. Ellen saw and felt it. Then he realized that he needed to connect his additional forces. But he didn't have time to do anything, as Odd struck harder and crushed his tail, completely breaking it into two parts. Having understood this, Ellen raised his tentacles to the mountain and aimed directly at his opponent. He tried to do it faster than he could understand what was happening. Suddenly Odie realized that the man had cut off his arm with his tentacles. His arm was gone above the elbow. The children stood stunned by what they saw in front of them. They forgot that they needed to run away and stood watching the events unfolding faster than one could think. Suddenly, Ellen rose higher on her tail and looked down at the man, showing all the confidence and power he possessed. He replied with a smile that he was actually sorry, but it was sarcasm because, of course, everything was quite the opposite. Ellen answered that the boy didn't even have time to use all his abilities. He didn't have a hand anymore. But he still stood stubbornly in front of him without running away or trying to save himself. Marco saw that the boy needed help and decided that he should help him. He tried to untie the bandages on his hands in order to help faster and more skillfully, but the girl who was next to him did not understand how he could do it because he was injured. But Marco suddenly felt that he became even worse. He fell to his knees and began to cough. He began to bleed. The boy could not understand what was happening to Mark. He tried to ask him, but he did not answer. Instead, Ellen admitted that it was a deadly poison that was applied by the weapon with which he hit Mark. While Marco almost did not feel reality, and he could not understand what was happening to him during that time, Ellen answered that it was a deadly poison and he had a maximum of 3 minutes left to live. Odie couldn't believe that he actually put a deadly poison on the weapon and decided to kill an innocent child who was mortal. Approaching closer to them, he got down on his feet and began to walk. He began to say that he did not tell about something. Maybe it was something very important but kept silent. He decided to kill the children whom he wanted to create for the sake of weapons, which were the only ones that survived among all the others. He killed him in order to get exactly his Oda who was standing in front of him, because as he was, he no longer needed those imitations that were children. Instead, the boy began to guess about the whole plan that Ellen probably had in mind. He said that he did not want to leave the children alive. He thought it through from the very beginning. Suddenly Marco heard that he had 3 minutes left. He decided that he would spend these 3 minutes with benefit. He rested his hand on the floor, thereby crushing it with his fist. The girl wanted to stop him, but Marco told her to listen carefully and remember everything he wanted to tell her. At that time, the hand that was cut off flew up because there was an engine in it, and it remotely directed its blow at Ellen. But at that time he managed to escape from it, and the hand returned to its owner, so they again stood facing each other ready for a fierce battle. Ellen lunged at Odie again with her tentacles and tried to give him a hand, but he managed to block the blow in time and deftly dodged the others. He picked up the tentacle that crashed into him and tore it in two, and he did it without much effort. This angered the man even more, so he decided to gather all his strength into a fist and pounced on him with double strength. But at that time, the boy saw that the fist flew at him with double force, so he immediately put his 2 hands together and they converged in one direction and in one place, creating a wave from its power that swept away almost everything in its path. This shock wave was so powerful that the concrete from which the floor was made cracked and rose up behind the men's feet. But suddenly the boy realized that something crawled on his hand. His attention was focused on his opponent, so he did not notice that something was on his hand. It was another of Ellen's tentacles that grabbed him and threw him up, lifting the boy completely. He spun and threw the boy with such force that the ground split apart completely, not only cracked, but completely rose up. The boy fell on his back and gasped for breath. Ellen decided not to leave it like that, so he hit the young man again while he was lying unable to get up. He held the boy, pressing him to the ground. It seemed that he had no other way but to give up, but the boy decided not to give up so easily, so he needed to come up with something right away. He realized that he had free legs that no one was holding, therefore, lifting them, he pushed Ellen away from him with all his strength, who instead flew up as high as possible so that he was almost invisible. Ellen did not have time to land on her feet without being injured, and at that time the boy also managed to rise to his feet. They stood opposite each other again and waited for one of them to take a step towards them. Ellen decided to press on the painful point and reminded that Marco had 2 minutes left to live, then he would die quickly. He asked what he would do at that time. The boy's thoughts quickly passed one after another. The first thought was that his body was very unusual for him. He would not be able to win it in 2 minutes. Therefore, the boy tried to come up with another plan very quickly in order to save Marco and win Ellen. But suddenly, in one moment, which passed so quickly that the boy did not even notice, he already flew back, not falling on his back, because Ellen struck first for him. The boy began to rise to his knees, but he was bored with his lessons, so he stood and tried to regain consciousness. Instead, the man stood behind him and adjusted the gloves he had on. In one moment he was already on the floor lying face down because Ellen stepped on his back and held him in such a position that he could not get up or react to something else. He was surprised because before the boy could do much more, did he become weaker while hiding for 3 years in a row. While the boy was lying on the floor, he realized that his body was not obeying at all, and that it was actually very weak. Ellen promised that he needed to end the children, and then he would be able to take the boy to a special person. At that time, while he was talking to the boy, he did not see that Marco actually hit him hard in the face. Instead, in response, Marco was able to deliver a blow, which was returned to him, and thereby surprised Odie. Marco stood in front of the boy and he could not understand how he did it because he thought that they were ordinary children who were experimented on, but they did not succeed where they were able to survive. Bullets were hidden in Marco's hands, which he covered with bandages, and with the outfits he could shoot. It was a truly deadly and powerful weapon. He told Odie that when he brought that man, he should not get off the device that could move them to a safe place because he still had less than 2 minutes to live. Lua started to worry about him and said what he could do in such a state because it was dangerous for him to overload himself. Instead, she just wanted to offer her help. But Marco cut him off because he said that he would die anyway and could do the same himself. Then he pointed out that if the man had lost, no one would have been able to escape from there. The girl started screaming and worrying about her friend because she wanted to offer another way that she didn't know yet, but she knew that there was another way. Instead, they suddenly heard other voices of the guards who began to approach the door, and one of them said that they should be broken because they were already broken. Marco realized that there was no way back and he decided that there was only one way and started reloading his hand with other and new bullets. Having prepared for a fierce struggle, he said that it was impossible to postpone this case any longer, because it had to be solved at that very moment, so he activated his Magnum mode. Therefore, he decided to ask his friend again if she could do everything as he told her before. The girl could not hold back her tears, so she burst into tears. Marco looked at her with despair, but with hope, and ran to save his savior. He tried to lift the boy and asked if he could move. Instead, Odie asked him why he was not yet where he asked him to be and started shooting. Marco replied that he was fine and that he should try to get to the device as soon as possible. He said that he needed to hold on a little longer, and ran to deliver his blow to Ellen. At that time, Lua approached the boy and asked if he was all right or if he might need help, but instead he was lying down and could not get up. Rising to his feet from the blow, Marco Ellen was surprised by his strength, because he had not seen it in him before. Maybe he got angry before his death and decided to show all his skills. When Odd got up, he held his head because he was still dizzy. He could not understand what was happening and watched the picture that was in front of him. When Marco was behind the panel he was controlling to send Odd and Lua, who was his sister, to another place. He asked him to take care of his sister because it was the only thing he had. By the time Odie realized what was happening, that he was already with Lua on the platform from which he could move to another place, he started shouting at Marco to leave the panel immediately because he was supposed to save their lives. When Odd wanted to get up, he couldn't because Lua decided to keep the promise she made to her brother and restrain him on the platform so that they could safely move to a safe place. Lua could not hold back her tears when she saw that Marco was already rubbing his hand on the starter lever. But suddenly he realized that something was wrong because he could not turn the lever down. While Marco was trying to start the car, Ellen stood behind and swung at the boys so that he could not move them. Odie suddenly tried to get up and help the boy, but he noticed that the man was trying to hit his back, so he shouted to Marco, warning him of the threat behind him. But the boy's body did not obey, so when his sister saw that her brother could be killed in front of her eyes, she screamed his name with tears on her face. Marco suddenly turned his head to see who was standing behind him, and realized what kind of figure it was. But suddenly Marco managed to escape there. Ellen missed and did not hit the guy. He hit the panel in front of which Marco was standing. But suddenly he realized that he didn't just hit the panel, but he hit something that couldn't move Marco and launched him. Suddenly the car started and jets of force hit the girl and the boy who were on the field for moving, and Marco remained lying near the panel and Ellen was standing next to him. When Marco raised his head to see if he had succeeded in what he planned earlier, he saw that he had succeeded in fulfilling his mission. At that time, the guards managed to break down the door that had been broken all the time the battle was going on there, and they were able to get inside. They saw their master standing with his back to them. One of the guards addressed him by name. But suddenly Ellen ordered that it was necessary to pick out all the garbage and kicked Marco, who was lying in front of him not breathing. Of course, the guards quickly began to clean up and did not argue with him in order to stay alive. Suddenly, the security guard who was cleaning Marco reported on the radio that one of the experimental subjects had died, but Ellen stood behind him and listened attentively. The guard continued to report that another escaped through the transfer device and the device was destroyed, so chasing those who escaped was unrealistic. Ellen stood and listened to this, understanding what had happened. Time passed. It was 5 in the morning near the workshop where drones were repaired. The bridge was still asleep and there was not a single living soul on the streets. Besides Cindy, who was waiting for the door to open, she was standing in front of the workshop and looked at her watch on her hand and wondered why the door was not open yet. She was also surprised because Odie was late because he was never late. So suddenly she decided to call to find out what was the matter. The girl was calling and waiting for someone to pick up the phone. She decided to look around the streets to see if anyone was there, and in the distance she saw some silhouettes. She could not understand who it was, but in the distance it was Odd, and he was carrying the girl in his arms, hugging her. But suddenly she realized that he was the one she was calling. She couldn't understand what happened because he wasn't himself. She couldn't understand who else it was. For several minutes they sat in the room and talked among themselves. Cindry asked Lua what her name was and apologized that they had nothing but cocoa. But if she wanted more, she just had to ask. The girl thanked quietly and sat at the table. When the girl looked down at the cocoa, her eyes became a little more cheerful. She was soothed by the aroma of cocoa and the taste it gave. She asked the girl to tell how she ended up there, and the girl was very alarmed and puzzled by this, as if this question scared her. But drinking cocoa, she calmed down, and did not know how to answer this question, so they spent several seconds in complete silence. Lua began to tell that she and Marco were from the same shelter. The girl and the boy sat and listened carefully to the girl without interrupting her. Lua continued to tell that she got there when she was just a baby. The girls and boys who were already there became her the same family as a real family could be for her. But every day, more and more places for children were established in the shelter. There were almost not enough places. The situation was really difficult. The situation at the shelter was getting worse and worse every day, so the conditions for Lua and Marco were getting worse and worse. Therefore, many children, including her and her brother, were sent to another institution. There was no other option then. But it seemed that everything was fine because their friends were not divided into different groups, and they could communicate as much as they wanted. The girl looked at the cocoa she was holding in her hands. then exhaled heavily when she started talking about the place they had come to. The place where they arrived was not at all similar to a children's shelter. It was much larger, and there were incomprehensible cocoons that were designed for the number that had just arrived. They could not understand where they had come and began to carefully examine everything that was in that room. They were afraid, but they tried to understand what was the matter. When they approached one of the cocoons, they saw that there was a boy in it who was breathing through the oxygen mask. "You are completely in the water." They were scared and were very surprised because when they saw it, they began to understand that what would happen to them was the same as to the boy who was in front of him. But suddenly they didn't have time to do something. As the guards released smoke that put all the children to sleep, they were lying on the floor. The guards were watching each of them. They all fainted so quickly that they could not understand how they were already lying on the floor. So then they began to perform various experiments on them. Finishing her cocoa, which she held in her hands, she continued howling that when she woke up, she looked around and saw that everyone was dead except Marco. Her cup in her hands began to tremble along with the girl she was talking about, but the tension grew with every second. Then she realized that not only everyone else was dead, but now Marco was dead, and the girl couldn't hold back her tears, so she burst into tears. Cindry could not restrain herself and threw herself into the girl's arms. She hugged her tightly and tried to calm her down, because she could not imagine what the girl was feeling at that moment. When Cindry hugged her, she said words with which she tried to comfort the girl who was crying in her arms. She said that everything was fine then. Instead, the boy sat in the corner of the sofa and listened to it with embarrassment, and understanding that at that moment, he could not do anything to save Marco's life. The girl was calmed down and put to sleep on the bed, where she fell fast asleep, because after all the events she had experienced, she needed a serious rest. Cindry and Odie went to another room to continue the conversation there so as not to wake up the girl who was fast asleep on the bed. She asked the young man what he wanted to do next because he had not completed the investigation about the Genesis weapon, or maybe he wanted to leave it unfinished. Since they already found out who this young man really was, he had to lie down, and he could no longer stay in that country because it was dangerous for him. Instead, the girl asked what he planned to do and what his next steps were. The young man replied that he planned to leave this place and go in search of the 2 Genesis weapons with which he escaped from the M3. They were 2 weapons called Despara and Arenal. After he found them, he would continue his investigation. The girl began to worry and decided to ask what other weapons he was talking about. She could not understand why so suddenly he decided to look for these weapons and asked if he knew where they were, to which the young man replied that he did not know at the time when Ellen told him. Suddenly thoughts swirled in the young man's head with incredible speed, and what would have happened if he had not left M3 and they probably could not conduct experiments on children. These thoughts and feelings oppressed him. Then the war allowed that they were creating a weapon that was similar to him, as many ideas as there were, so they had to destroy that city before this could happen again. But the girl began to express her fears at the expense of the fact that he could not know for sure whether they would agree to help him, and besides, he could not believe Ellen's words because those scoundrels were simply provoking him. Since they were on the outskirts of the city, he didn't need to take any risks and could stay there and live with Lua. Besides, they wouldn't be able to suspect if he continued his work. But suddenly their conversation was interrupted by the radio, which was turned on, because the news at 6 in the morning was scheduled and went like a Swiss watch. And Cindry hastened to turn off the radio because they had a rather serious conversation that could not be postponed for later. But the girl did not have time to turn off the radio when it was broadcast that a mass murder was committed near the M3 plant that day at 3 o'clock in the morning. Later, radio receivers reported that the criminal was in the form of a titan and was killing people, so the video surveillance cameras recorded how he stole a human girl who was not far from the factory. Then they broadcast on the radio that they had a photo that was taken at the scene of the crime, so they asked everyone to look carefully at such photos. Instead, Cindry screamed. They were so scared. Suddenly, she realized that they were talking about the boy who was standing behind her. But Odie could not believe that it was about him, because he did not kill anyone. And then he understood what was the matter and heard that the police were looking for this criminal. The radio receiver was not breathing and reported that if anyone could spot the criminal and the girl who was stolen, they should be contacted urgently. But the radio receiver did not have time to finish everything that was planned, as the girl hit it, breaking it and turning it off. The girl was not jokingly angry because she could not understand whether they lived in their own world or what the problem was, because it was impossible to manipulate the facts like that. Instead, the boy thought that they started to act much faster than he expected from them, and if this could continue, they did not understand how it could all end. Suddenly he called the girl to talk and discuss in more detail the whole plan that came to his mind. So he decided that he and the girl would cross the border, and that they would not be able to get her, and therefore he asked her to return home immediately, and stay safe. At that time, the girl who was sleeping on the bed had already woken up and was holding the gun that her brother Mark gave her before his death, and asked to do his order, as he said before. But suddenly the girl heard a scream that was going on behind the wall, and an argument that was developing stronger and stronger with every minute. Minutes passed and the argument did not breathe and seemed even louder. The girl behind the wall, said that she could not leave them and she could go with them. But the guy firmly refused her, arguing that it was very dangerous for her. But she said that she worked with him many years ago, they could definitely get out on her. The guy tried to leave her in a safe place, but she said that if he wasn't there she didn't have to stay there, and it was too obvious that he could understand that. Lua quietly stood by the door and began to listen in on their conversation. Suddenly she heard that the young man said that he owed his life to the boy who saved him from death by substituting his own. But the girl firmly stood her ground and said that since Marco was already dead, he must protect the girl who remained, so she also wanted to make every effort to help them. She demanded that the young man become smarter and shoulder this great burden alone. But suddenly he realized that he would not stop this girl and ordered her to gather all her things as soon as possible because they needed to leave that place as soon as possible. Then the girl decided to ask if he was asking the thoughts of the girl who was quietly sleeping on the bed to the extreme extent what they were thinking at that moment. After all, they did not know, maybe the girl wanted to stay there and forget everything that happened. But suddenly the girl entered the room and interrupted their conversation by saying that she would definitely go with them. She confidently stood in the doorway and said that she was ready for anything, but she had one small request for them. But suddenly they were surprised by the fact that the girl heard their entire conversation, and were a little embarrassed in front of her. Lua added that she heard their entire conversation throughout her dream and that they had to go find another Genesis weapon to completely wipe out the M3 from their land. Odie tried to say that if the girl wanted to stay where she was at that moment, he could think of something so that she could stay there and not worry about anything else because he took her away for her safety. But suddenly the girl remembered the moment when her brother gave her a gun and ordered her to protect herself and the boy who saved them. She understood that all that time was exactly when everyone was protecting her, and then a completely different time had come when she needed to protect others. She wanted to do all this so that she would no longer have to lose people close to her. So she was ready to be taught to fight so that she could protect not only herself but others whom she loved and trusted. She was ready for anything to become stronger and take revenge for everything M3 did to her and her brother and everyone she knew. She said that since her abilities were not very useful in a duel, she could learn to shoot a gun well. Tears rolled down her eyes and the guy hurried to calm her down and said that he understood her like no one else. But he decided to tell and warn her that war and battles were for adults, and she didn't need to fight, but she needed to learn to protect herself first of all. So the weapon they were going to find shot very well, and she could learn this art. The girl with a smile and tears in her eyes thanked him and knew that he could really help her. Meanwhile, at the factory where weapons were made, night fell and Ellen was in one of the offices with a young man with whom they were talking. He suddenly asked if he had found Odie's location in order to find and take revenge for the fact that he left earlier and took the girl with him. But suddenly the young man replied that they had not found anything yet, but it was necessary to wait a little so that the police could help them and find them first. But suddenly these words made the man very angry. Out of anger, he almost hit the young man, but he was a centimeter away from him, because it was not enough for him. Suddenly, he grabbed the young man by his tie and started shouting that if the general director found out about everything, they would be very unlucky, so it was necessary to immediately find that scumbag. He was ready to give everything he could. Suddenly the young man stopped touching the floor and prayed for conception and said that he was doing everything in his power. But this did not stop the man. He continued to strangle the young man and did not spare him. In a moment he let go of the young man, and he fell to the floor and began to breathe the air that quickly entered his lungs. The man turned around and ordered to find Odie as soon as possible. The young man was sitting on the floor and holding his throat, which was sore from being almost strangled, and he was angry at the man because he only lashed out at him. When the man left, suddenly the young man's phone rang and he picked up the phone to talk and understand who it was. Suddenly he was told news that shocked him. Suddenly he informed his master Ellent that they had some problems. He said that they were summoned by the general director, and he ordered all the weapons of Genesis to be transferred to the main office. This terrible information angered Ellent even more because what he thought began to come true. At that time, in the very slums of Sector C, a grandmother from the same city put the child to sleep and said that she thought that the information they heard on the radio station was false. She began to say that everyone knew how that young person helped people in those areas. Why such a good person could do such a thing? It was very difficult for her to believe in such a thing. But suddenly the man who was sitting on the edge of the bed also answered that he did not believe in that information because it was clear that someone was setting him up and doing it on purpose. Suddenly, her husband got out of bed and decided to leave. When she asked where he had gone, he replied that he was feeling bad and decided to breathe fresh air to improve his condition. But suddenly, when he had just crossed the threshold of the house and went outside, he called and said that he wanted to report the location of the wanted criminal and asked what the reward was for such information. At that time, Cindry went to the office where Odie was with the girl and they were repairing the car they had found. But suddenly, when she saw the car they were repairing, she was shocked because it was really beautiful. She decided to ask witnesses if they had found such a car, to which the young man replied that he had found it a few months ago. It had been thrown into a junkyard, so he decided to collect and repair it. That girl, with a serious expression on her face, replied that she did not trust him and asked to give the keys to the car so that she could check it herself. But the boy suddenly stopped her by holding her hand because he felt someone's presence near them. They all became alert together and listened to the sounds that were on the street. Instead, the girl suggested that she use her powers and check if anyone was outside. Suddenly she closed her eyes and began to search for other people or the presence of anyone else on the street. Sparkles of the color of her blue eyes spread around her, and she noticed that there were people near the house who came after them. They surrounded them completely, so the anxiety fell on her shoulders in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, in the main office of Sector A of the city of Tristan, a conversation was taking place between the boy and Ellent. He asked the boy if they were able to find their storage. Why, he replied that they received information from the police and sent the drones and the police to the place itself. The guy hastened to say that if the police deal with them, they won't need to interfere with the problems anymore. The man replied that there was no reason for them to fail the task test, so it was necessary to prepare for it properly in the proper form. At that time, it was restless in Oda's workshop, because the girl saw that there were many people standing around her who surrounded her, and would not let her go out. Also, the atmosphere inside was quite tense. She hastened to report that 3 people had climbed to the 2nd floor and there were not only people on the street, but drones, so they were completely surrounded. She panicked and didn't know what to do, so she asked the boy. Cindry suggested whether they could just get rid of them, but the man replied that the street was too narrow, so he could sit them too. Then the girl suggested that it was possible to take the tools and attack them as they had no other way out, and had to survive. But the boy replied that it was nothing against them at all. But the girl, without giving up, asked what was needed, what could be done. Since he could not fight them at that moment, it was necessary to come up with another plan. But the boy immediately understood that in the situation in which they found themselves, he had nowhere to go, he had no other choice, he had to fight in the form of a titan to survive. The police were standing outside and quietly agreed that after the countdown on the clock, they should break down their door and enter the middle. This plan had already been agreed with the whole team. Since the clock already showed the time that it was necessary to go inside, the commander ordered one of the soldiers to prepare to go inside. The guards did not have time to count down to 3 when a guy in a Titan uniform burst out of the door and aimed a gun at them and began to defend himself. But when they had time to count to 3 by 3, they flew out of the garage in a car and sat all 3 in it. They took out the door and knocked down a couple of policemen. The commander, as well as the soldiers, were shocked by what they were doing, so the angry commander said that it was necessary to pursue them immediately in order to catch them as soon as possible. One of the fighters they shot down remained on the hood of the car and tried to shoot at them as they drove. Everyone who was sitting in the car tried to duck so as not to get hit by bullets, and it was still dangerous to sit in a car that was going at a crazy speed and being shot at on the way. Suddenly, the girl asked the boy if he had a better way, because it was quite dangerous and risky, but the answer was that he shouted for her to hold on to something so as not to fall out of the car. Suddenly, the guy shifted into another gear and began to turn the steering wheel to the left quickly enough to throw the criminal off the hood. They were driving in the oncoming lane where there were other cars, so they tried to react quickly enough to avoid colliding with an oncoming car. But suddenly they finally threw away what they had on the hood and quickly drove away. But suddenly the police started chasing them on motorcycles and started shooting at them. But suddenly the commander ordered them not to shoot live because they were told to take them alive and bring them to Elent. Cindry suddenly suggested that the police might be M3 puppets and asked Lua not to raise her head back. But suddenly one of the policemen began to catch up with them and almost reached the same level as the car. The guy noticed this and understood that the case was generally bad. The policeman attached a device to the car that could stop them. Suddenly, the girl who was sitting next to Sunbae realized that the car started to slow down a little, so she started to panic. But suddenly the guy realized that they could have attached the exact device to the car. When he looked closely, he realized that this was exactly the case. When he realized that it was what he thought it was the gearbox, he asked the girl who was sitting next to me to hold the steering wheel. He warned her that it had to be removed immediately, but she did not understand how to control properly, and started screaming. Suddenly, the policeman who attached this device to the car remotely saw from his special device that the car had already started to slow down, and reported this to his colleagues. Therefore, the commander quickly ordered them to immediately clean up on it and take the child there, until he removed the gearbox. One of the soldiers announced that he wanted to do this and began to perform actions. Suddenly, he approached their car so quickly and began to grab the girl. But suddenly Cindry, who was sitting in front, saw in the rearview mirror that the girl was about to be stolen, but Lua did not understand this yet because she did not see it. Suddenly, the policeman who had already climbed into the back of the car was over the girl and was ready to take her away. But the girl did not want to give up just like that, so she began to say goodbye and resist so that she would not be taken away. Suddenly, she screamed at Sunbae and asked if he had much longer because Lua was in danger. At that time, the guy was trying to reach for the gearbox to finally remove it and start driving at normal speed. When he finally reached this device, which was attached to the car door, he removed it and crushed it with one hand. But suddenly the policemen who were driving behind them noticed that he had removed the gearbox and became angrier. Suddenly he warned the girls to go to the place they talked about earlier, and he could contact them later because they couldn't get off his tail. Suddenly, he pounced on the policeman who was behind to knock him out of the car, and the girls could safely go to the place they talked about earlier. Instead, the girl sitting in the back seat of the car saw that her life was saved again and looked back at the boy. In the meantime, Elent went to the main office of the general director. It was a pillar of heaven located on the top floor. When the chief saw him, he realized that he had not seen him for a long time, and bowing to his waist, he apologized for being late. But the chief replied that it was simple because he called him to him very unplanned, so he told him to sit on the free city that was in front of him. He quickly poured coffee and brought it to his colleagues. When he brought the coffee, he said that the fast food couldn't come because he had other things to do. But he was very happy to see all of them because it had been a long time and he was worried about how they were doing. But suddenly the girl who was sitting said that it was necessary to be quiet, because he came to meet with fast food, and the one who needed it did not come. There were only people who did not bring any benefit. Holding a lit cigarette in her hands, she said that if it was something not very important, she could go. But suddenly Clairden, who was also the main weapon of the Genesis, replied that she was an incredibly rude person and asked if the head director was his friend because it was impossible to communicate with a senior in rank. When the headmaster handed Valence a cup of coffee, he said that it remained as cold as it was because it had been so long before she could relax. Clairden turned to the general director and said that he was very kind and that he should not pay attention to her, but he laughed a little and answered that everything was fine. Suddenly, when everyone was already seated, he began to tell why he called them all to his office. What he wanted to say took them a lot of time and effort, and it was at that time that they were ready to implement a project called Renaissance. Like Desper, Arenal and Odie were missing, he decided to find an alternative since a lot of time had passed since that day. Then he remembered that there were only 2 successful experiments from that time, But nothing came of it. He decided to praise Ellen for those projects because he worked well on them. The chief director continued that he had been dreaming about the implementation and success of that project for 2 years, so he made them sit in front of him in order to make sure that the end was already near. Ellen understood what it was to share and what the matter was about. Suddenly Valens asked Ellen what was wrong with his face, because he was sitting as if he did not belong to him, to which he replied that it was none of her business. But suddenly the chief director announced that before the start of their project, he should look at those on whom the experiments were conducted, but he heard that something had happened at the factory. Suddenly Ellen did not know what to answer. Suddenly he was informed that he had an urgent report from the head of the security service, so he asked to be connected with him. The head of the security service replied that he had an urgent message about the events that took place that day, to which the chief director replied that he was interested in whether it was a case of murder or something else that remained a mystery to him. But suddenly the head of the security service reported that it was not a murder, it was a weapon of Genesis. It was Odie who disappeared after the war and ran away with a girl who was being experimented on. But suddenly these words angered the chief director so much that he didn't even hear what she said out of anger. Suddenly, for the girl who was sitting with them, it also became a very big surprise. She couldn't believe her ears and decided to ask again if she didn't think so. Clarendon was pleasantly surprised. A smile appeared on his face. He said that he could not even imagine that the boy had survived. Suddenly, the CEO turned to Ellen and asked if he knew about this situation before. His voice was serious and slow. Suddenly, the chief director warned him that if he was hiding something, it was better to tell at that very moment so that it wouldn't get worse, and the man was really scared at that time. The chief director became even more angry and suddenly he made indentations in the table with his nails. He warned him to tell quickly until they returned him to the garbage dump and he became part of the iron and could not speak. Meanwhile, Odd fell to the floor with the bodyguard whom he knocked out of the car and they lay motionless. Suddenly he realized that he could not withstand such a strong blow. He began to shake. He realized that his body became weaker than usual. But why this happened he could not understand. Meanwhile, when he raised his head, he saw in front of him the police approaching him. They began to open fire on the young man in order to detain him, or even kill him. But the young man understood that it was not a simple weapon, it was special elements. When they opened, the current hit the young man, thereby making him safer for the police, who must take him alive. Suddenly, the police commander said that it was necessary to catch that girl and the other one who was with her. They should be taken alive. And when he turned his head and saw that the boy was no longer dangerous, he told them to turn off the electricity. Suddenly, he announced to the boys that under that special current he would not be able to move even if he wanted to, so he was forced to surrender and tell where the 2 girls had gone. But suddenly the young man tried to raise his hand despite this current, and ordered to remove it immediately. Suddenly, one of the police officers told him that there was no point in resisting because they had a backup plan. But suddenly he got off the police officer and knocked him to the floor no matter what. As he began to transform into the form of a titan, he noticed that nothing could restrain him, especially what he held in his hands. Suddenly, a smoke screen appeared and the police commander warned them to close fire and not shoot because they could aim at each other. But within a few minutes of the smoke curtain, the guy managed to disappear from the sight of the policemen. They could not find him until one of them saw him. And you did not inform the commander. Suddenly they saw a young man who jumped high into the sky. He was almost invisible. He was only a small speck in the sky. Suddenly, they noticed that during a high jump, he completely changed the form of a titan and one of them realized that he was unusual. But the commander interrupted them and ordered not to admire him, but to catch him. Suddenly, the young man landed on the roof of the house and realized that he had not calculated the power of energy. It was not clear to him what the problem was. Maybe it was something in the core. He got up and looked at them from a height, and he understood that when he broke away from them, he would definitely check his body. But suddenly the young man realized that someone landed loudly behind him, breaking the concrete floor with his feet. When he saw those robot creatures that came after him, he realized that it would still take him some time. But he didn't have him anyway, so he had to hurry urgently. At that time, there was a queue at the city's central station, where the police were checking all tickets and IDs, and there was quite a long queue. The girls were already sitting in the car and Cindry was driving and she was looking out the window and worried about Odie. She was worried about what had happened to him, because she had come to the very place where the young man had informed her. She was thinking about whether it would be possible for them to come to a checkpoint and get on the ship. Lua suddenly asked where the man who saved her was, and she hoped that he was already on his way to them, to which Cindry replied that of course he was already on his way to them. Therefore, she offered to go to a quiet place and wait for him. Then the girl began to worry even more and count the seconds that passed before Sunbae would come. Meanwhile, the young man was running and running away from the bombs that were being dropped on him, and they exploded meters away from him. Suddenly, his opponent jumped so high and landed that the wave knocked the young man aside. Suddenly, he landed on his feet so as not to fall and noticed the drone they had launched, which blew up. Suddenly, he decided to say that it was a military drone that was protecting the city, so the safety of the people living in this city was probably not very important to him. He wanted to fight, but he had other plans that could not wait, so when he arrived at the house, he began to run away from the video explosions that echoed behind him. And this had to be done until the moment his body condition became worse, so it was necessary to run away as quickly as possible. Suddenly, an advertisement flying over him announced that everyone who lives in that city was informed that the police were looking for a murderer and a kidnapper in their sector. When he raised his head up, he realized that this advertisement was really boring. They continued to announce that serious damage to the sector was found, and if they suddenly saw it, it was necessary to report it urgently. Suddenly, the so-called murderer and kidnapper and a girl with red hair were shown on the advertising screen. Suddenly the young man realized that it was Cindry, and they began to look for her already. It is not clear from where a male robot appeared in front of the young man who wanted to catch him. When he started shooting at the boy, he realized that things were really bad because he couldn't fight because he didn't have the strength. Something was wrong with his body, and he had to hurry because they were waiting for him. Suddenly that man exploded and blew up almost half of the house. Then the boy realized that they were actually very dangerous. At that time, there was also an advertisement at the station that a criminal was wanted, and on the screen there was a girl with red hair, and in another photo the same girl in a car, and in the back of the city a girl with light blonde hair. Then they realized that they actually had problems because they were wanted for a secret hiding place. The girl began to worry even more and could not understand when he would finally come because the police were more and more. Suddenly, the girl sitting behind saw that there were actually more and more of them, and that they probably wouldn't be able to get on the ship or pass the inspection. Cindry said that she also thinks about it, and is very worried about it. But Odd had already come up with this plan, so they didn't have to worry, but had to wait for it, because he knew one city from where they could leave the country. Cindry offered to hide until he came, because it was dangerous to stay just like that, leading everyone, so they began to hope that he would come as soon as possible. But suddenly the girl saw that they had been noticed by the police and ordered them to fasten their seat belts because it was necessary to wait as soon as possible. While one of the men who worked for the police approached her to conduct a brief inspection, he asked her to show her ID. But suddenly the girl pushed the policeman away and started driving very quickly to somehow hide from them. Suddenly, one of the employees told the others on the radio that he had found those who were wanted, so it was necessary to urgently raise all the barricades. Cindry tried to drive very fast, and she already saw the way out in front of her. Suddenly, the girl sitting in the back said that they would be able to go out there, but she was very worried about this. But she told with great confidence not to worry and trust her. Then when she sped up she told you to get it even stronger. But suddenly she turned the steering wheel so fast that they turned around almost in the city, and drove very fast in the opposite direction. They approached the policemen who made barricades so that they would not break through them and detain them. Suddenly they opened fire and started aiming and shooting at them to stop them somehow. Suddenly, they aimed at the driver's window and the girl managed to dodge so that the bullets did not hit her. But suddenly she accelerated even faster and began to turn the steering wheel a little the other way. The police could not understand what was happening and even stopped the fire and carefully watched what would happen next. Suddenly they blew their barricade apart with their speed and burst past it. But suddenly the police, who had just arrived and saw this, were shocked and therefore reported on the walkie-talkie for others to block the entire central street. Lua, who was sitting in the back seat, was very scared and even cried. Suddenly, Cindry asked her if everything was fine or if she was not injured, while the girl replied that she drives more dangerously than the man who saved her. But suddenly a tail of the police formed with them, who told them to immediately stop the car, and it seemed that otherwise they would be forced to open fire on them. But the girl was even more angry because they had already opened fire before that, so she did not understand what to do. Suddenly, they heard a voice speaking to them on the radio in the car. Then it was not clear that it was Odie asking if they were all right or if they were alive. Lua was very happy because she heard his voice and could not contain her happiness. Suddenly, the girl was driving and at the same time screaming when he would come, because they almost died and were in danger at the same moment. At that time, walking along the roofs of the building, he replied that he would be at the station soon enough so that they would not get lost, and do what he said. He told them to come to the control zone and go to the strip where the planes fly from. The girl was very surprised that they would not board the plane. Jumping further on the roof of the building, he answered that they should go faster to the runway and wait for him right at the gate. But the girl understood that there was no road further there, so they definitely could not be caught easily enough. Suddenly they realized that they opened fire again and started kissing not only the car but the people sitting in it. The commander ordered his charge, who was sitting nearby, to aim at the engine to stop them faster. Suddenly, they began to wear them all over the road, because they were trying to run away not only from the police, but also from bullets flying at the speed of sound. Cindry asked if Lua was feeling well, to which she replied that everything was fine in general, but she was just a little scared. Suddenly, she decided to ask the guy over the walkie-talkie if there was any other way. The guy said that there was no time to think and that she could trust him at that time when a projectile hit the car. The radio wave was interrupted and they could not hear each other. The young man began to panic and ask what happened. Then he realized that the connection was lost and saw that his tail was coming with him, which was catching up with him, and they also opened fire on him. But turning sharply and deflecting the laser beam that was aimed at him, he replied that he was not interested in them now. But those creatures did not give up hope and ran after him in the hope of catching him or killing him. The young man decided to turn around and deal with them once and for all. He simply began to open their heads one by one in order to finally break away from them. Meanwhile, the girls were driving in the car and didn't know what to do, because it was risky to trust the boy, but they had no other choice. But suddenly the girl who was driving turned the car around and replied that if they were caught, she would curse him for the rest of her life. Suddenly, they began to announce information to all passengers, while the girls behind the wheel began to drive over the people standing in line and warn everyone to go in other directions. They managed to escape through the door, and due to the trespassers entering the station, the movement of all aircraft was stopped. While the girls were driving incredibly fast, repeating the same thing that the traffic was stopped, the passengers started shouting and getting angry. Lua began to worry about whether they accidentally injured someone. But the girl replied that everything was fine, they did not hit anyone. They only had to wait for Sunbae there, so she decided to slow down and get there faster. But the girl did not have time to increase her speed when she realized that they were aimed directly at the car. They stopped abruptly and were almost on a cliff where there was nothing wrong movement, and they could fall into the abyss. The police chief answered on the walkie-talkie to the others that the car with the target they needed had stopped. That's why he ordered the others on the radio to surround them very quickly to take them alive and unharmed. The girl reported that they were standing at the very edge of the abyss and ordered to get out of the car before it fell and run. Suddenly all the police officers got out of the cars and started approaching them and warning them not to move because they could easily fall, so they didn't tell them to sit and not move and they could get them. Suddenly, they heard a familiar voice telling them not to unbuckle their seat belts, and they realized that it was Odie. Suddenly, it is not clear from where, the boy landed on the floor and crushed everything around. The police did not understand where he came from. When he returned to his Titan form, the police realized that it was him, so the commander-in-chief ordered them to open fire on him. They opened fire and began to aim at him, and tried to do so until he came close to them. But suddenly the young man pushed the car off the cliff and the car flew down into the city with the girls in him. All the police officers were very shocked by this, and could not find any other words. The girls sitting in the car were also surprised and did not know what to do, they just held on tight. Suddenly, one of the police reported that there were 4 kilometers below to fly freely. Suddenly, the girls began to take offense and ask why he did what he had to do at that time. But the boy in the form of a Titan began to run with him along the wall that led to the bottom and grabbed the car. Suddenly, in one moment, he was able to grab it. When he took her from under him, he ordered them to lie their teeth so as not to bite their tongues. Suddenly, the young man carefully began to lower them down the ledge on the building, holding them with his hands. They landed so hard that the floor split completely under them. This game is a hit which sounded from the place from the very bottom on scared the police, and they thought that they died, so one of them informed the others to inform the superiors that the target fell outside their city. At that time, they were sitting in the car and trying to understand whether they were alive or not. Cindry was crying and quickly asked Lua if she was alive, and she was crying too and said that she was definitely alive but she wasn't 100% sure. When the girl turned her head to the left, she realized that she was not in the city where she had been all her life, so she was shocked by what she saw outside the city. But suddenly Odie, who was still holding the car in his hands, warned them to get off and then admired the scenery of a city they had not seen yet. Suddenly, when everyone got out of the car, Cindry started yelling at Odie and said that he did not warn them that he would not go down in this way. But the young man replied that everything was fine because they survived. But then he said that they had no other way. He started to say something else, but the pain he felt interrupted all thoughts. Lua asked him if everything was fine with him. It was possible that everything happened because of the shock and stress they experienced. The young man confirmed that he was just tired and needed to rest, so there was nothing to worry about. So the girl decided to suggest that they keep their ears sharp and rest a little before going on the long journey that was waiting for them. Suddenly he replied that there was no sense in need. Then he asked what happened to the car, why the girl replied that she did everything she could but she lost her bag with tools. So they decided to look for the nearest village to repair the car. Therefore, the young man put on his coat and ordered to follow him quickly, not to hesitate for a moment. But the girls decided to ask him once again if he is all right or if he definitely does not need rest. He only said that she would be driving, to which she replied that she thought so. Time passed. They were already 6,000 kilometers west of their place Tristan. At that time, two men were walking and talking. One of them could not understand why they had come so far just to catch them, but the other argued that they had come to their place. One of them said that there are more and more criminals every day, and those scoundrels from Tsav do not even want to touch a finger. Why did the other answer that it was not their duty to catch criminals? But he answered that it was still possible to help each other because there were a lot of selfish scoundrels from that city. Suddenly, the commander realized that the west wind was blowing with some vibrations and stopped. Or maybe he could be wrong. His friend suggested that it could be because of the circumstances they had because times were really hard then. Suddenly, we did not see a very large number of buildings that were abandoned. There was a whole city. There were even human remains. The place was seen to be abandoned quite a long time ago. Maybe some kind of apocalypse or war came because it looks extremely bad. Suddenly, his friend pulled out a bag with him and answered that it was unlikely that people could ever live there, so they doubted that they could find something really necessary for them. But his friend replied that they need to be very careful because they do not know what awaits them, and they have never been to that place. But his friend replied that he should not be accepted because everyone knew what he was capable of. While walking and talking with his friend, he did not pay attention to the fact that someone was already standing in front of him. Suddenly, his friend in the square stopped him by covering him with his hand and warned him that someone was walking there, but he did not even notice. But suddenly the young man who was in front of them stood, and it suddenly snowed and he didn't have one sock or shoe. Suddenly the chief decided to check if this young man was alive. He took his hand and checked the pulse on it. Suddenly he realized that he was alive. But he was dehydrated, so he asked his friend to get water from the bag, who in turn was surprised that there were still people in such ruins. Suddenly, some Sofa who was on top of the junk stood with a gun and asked who they were and not to touch his slave. He warned them if you didn't want to die to stay alive, you had to leave your things and run away from there. Suddenly, the two comrades realized that it was a camp of violators, and the chief got up while holding a cry. You replied that their clearing area had increased again. A cardboard comrade in a mask and glasses warned his commander in the square that he could deal with them and quickly solve the problem. Why he replied that he would do it himself. Suddenly, the main comrade took off his mask and warned him to stay away from him so as not to accidentally hit him. Meanwhile, in the city of Tristan, specifically in the M3 hangar, preparation was ongoing. Suddenly, a guy came up to Ellen's back and informed him that the preparations for the flight had been completed. He replied that he would come down as soon as possible. Suddenly he stood and looked at the preparation that had already ended. He thought about those two children that one died and one remained, but she managed to escape. These thoughts did not leave him. Then he realized that the girl didn't just run away, but outside their city it became much more complicated. The man decided to apologize to his CEO that this happened because he planned to catch Odie with the help of the girl, but he did not know that this could happen. But Wayland suddenly became even more angry and could not understand whether this was really his justification for such a serious act. Suddenly the head director broke his silence there, and replied that those two children were the main ones for their project and they couldn't help but know that, so they should still act quite carefully, but Ellen did the opposite. Then the headmaster suggested that maybe he was too confused because of what he had with Odo in the past. Maybe that made his mind more cloudy. The girl began to say that he was constantly hiding all this time and suddenly decided to secretly come to their factory. Maybe he learned about their projects and decided to prevent them from realizing them. Suddenly, the chief director's thoughts began to spin and he realized that he could not find out about their plans because he had been hiding for a long time and suddenly found them, and all this was quite clear because there was an explanation. The chief director suggested out loud that he accidentally found their children, who were being experimented on, so most likely he sneaked into the factory for a completely different reason. So they summed up everything once again, that Odie accidentally found those children, and there was no other choice because why did he have to show himself, and show that he was alive at all? Claredon said that he was probably hiding from them for another reason, because he did not understand why he left what he was doing in order to save others. But the chief director denied that the boy used to be like that even before he became a member of the project, and became a weapon in general. So they could not delay pursuing them any longer because the matter had to be completed as soon as possible. That's why the chief director said that he will personally monitor these events. Suddenly, Ellen replied that he would definitely correct his mistake, and asked to give him another chance. Suddenly, the director replied that he would give him another chance because he knows what achievements he has, so he decided to put it in him one more time. Ellen mentally set a goal in his head. He must catch Oda's father's girl and one of them must be alive. When he left for his flying ship, the army followed him, and he realized that he would do it no matter what. At that time, Odie and Lua from Cindry were walking through the desert and the boys started a conversation about their plan. Since they had already broken away from everyone else, he decided to tell in more detail. Their main task was to find Despera and Arenal, so they should head west. Odie put a map on the hood of the car and showed with his finger where and through which cities they would need to pass. But from the beginning they must bypass the Tsav structures and then find the anarchic cities. After the explanation, he asked if anyone had any questions. Lua decided to ask the question first, so she asked what the anarchy cities were. Odie began to tell the girl that many weak states had collapsed since the war, and many of them had been taken over by stronger countries. But there were cities that were not captured by other states, and they remained in ruins and people lived in them. They are called anarchic cities. Cindry suddenly intervened in their conversation and reported that she heard that most of the people who lived there were criminals, and then asked if they would be there when they were around. Instead, Odie replied that there were many countries that used M3 satellites. Also, if the weapons of Genesis were located in one of these countries, they would have been found quickly. Odie was hiding in the areas of Tristan, where there were no cameras, then everything was fine. Cindry thought about those anarchic cities in her voice. Suddenly Odie decided to add that the information was not accurate enough, and that we needed to leave urgently. In the meantime, two friends who were walking through the deserted city and came across a city with criminals tied everyone up and cleaned the city from the bottom, i.e. made it empty. They were quite surprised that they even had a bus, so he asked how long they had been engaged in robbery. But there was no time for such questions, it was necessary to go urgently. Suddenly, they began to take out the slaves of those robbers and put them in buses to finally take them out of those ruins. Those unfortunate people were very grateful to their saviors. Meanwhile, the robbers were kneeling with their hands tied behind. One of them asked his comrade where they came from because he was unable to attack even once. Another, who was also kneeling just on the other side of their heads, asked if they would sit like that and do nothing, to which he replied that it was better at that moment to leave it as it was. Their leader had already made a plan in his head. He decided that they would follow them and then attack their city in response. But in a matter of seconds the city, or rather the ruins that remained, exploded behind them, behind its inhabitants, who were bound on their knees. All this was done by the man in the hood because he overheard their conversation and suggested that they repeat what they had said before. because then there could be even worse consequences. Then death for them would not be fleeting and long. Odd offered to sit behind the wheel because he could see that the girl was tired, but she replied that she could drive because he had already been behind the wheel for 4 days in a row. But the guy replied that you can't drive when you really want to sleep because you need to rest and catch your breath. So they decided to rest. In the end they stopped, and Odie got out of the cars and stood on the edge of the mountain, and Cindry and Lua remained sitting in their seats. Suddenly Lua woke up in the back seat. She was finally able to sleep, and immediately after waking up, she asked where they were before Cindry replied that they had stopped to rest. Cindry noticed that the girl was sweating and suddenly asked if she was in pain, to which the girl replied that she was fine. But Cindry did not believe her, because it was very clear from her face that something had definitely happened to her, so she offered to drink water. Odd looked through the binoculars to see what was ahead, and suddenly he noticed a garden. Finally, they came to a city for the first time in 4 days on the road. But when they arrived in the city, they realized that there were just ruins from the city, because there was nothing else there. They were very surprised at what they saw. Odie said that he needed to look around, and as he left he called Cindry, who was standing next to him, for a few words. He told her that he also noticed that Lua did not tolerate their trip well, so he asked to take care of her while he left to explore the surroundings. The girl replied that he should not worry because she could handle it. The guy said that he would not go far, so it would be enough for her to just call him, and he would come at the same second. The girl agreed and asked him to be careful. When Cindry approached the girl, she asked how she was feeling, and if she was not feeling well, she could lie down and sleep some more. But as you noticed, Cindry Lua didn't sleep well and it worried her. But the girl lowered her head to the bottom and answered that it was not difficult for her. But when she fell asleep there was one moment that did not give her peace, and it was a dream that she constantly had. Cindry decided to ask if the girl could tell what kind of dream it was that kept her awake day and night. The girl, standing in silence for a few seconds, as if hesitating, later answered that she constantly dreamed of Marco. Then with a slight smile she added that he smiles at her when he dreams. But suddenly the girl cried and replied that he would rather be angry with her, because she really regretted that she had survived alone, so Marco could not understand the pain that the girl felt. But suddenly Lua, wiping her eyes from tears, apologized to Cindry because she did not want to show herself from that side because it was still very difficult for her to accept the fact that her brother would never be around. Cindry suddenly threw herself into her arms and answered that she did not need to apologize because there was nothing and there was no need to suffer or feel guilty for what happened. Then she added, holding the girl in both arms, that it was her fault, because as an adult she should have thought about what could have happened and then asked Lua for forgiveness. Lua in his arms, Cindry replied that Marco would definitely not regret the decision she made, so she needed to learn to live happily, as Marco hoped for. Some time passed and the girls were sitting near the car on the ground. Cindry asked how the girl was feeling, to which she replied that she actually felt much better then. Then she added that when she wants to cry, it's better not to hold back because no one would punish her for that. Suddenly Cindry remembered that Odie went to check the neighborhood and asked where he had been for so long because she was already hungry. Suddenly, Lua remembered one thing that seemed important to her in order to voice it to her out loud for Cindry. The girl asked why Sunbae came to the factory where she and her brother were at the time. After all, the girl didn't even think that anyone could save them and later remembered what Sunbae told her, that he came to find something. Cindry replied that he went there to find information about the Genesis weapon, but suddenly Lua replied that he himself was the weapon he was looking for. The girl added that he needed information more about himself than about the weapon because he had no memories of who he was before he became that deadly weapon. Meanwhile, the young man, walking and checking all the surroundings, found a trace of a big breakdown and realized that he had appeared there not too long ago, but he could not understand how. Suddenly he realized that someone was running behind him. After 1 second he was hit on the back and head from behind. But he was not greatly frightened by that blow on the head, because he did not really understand what it was exactly. He almost did not feel it. When he turned his head to the left, he noticed those people out of the corner of his eye. The man who hit him on the head with a stick was very surprised because the boy did not faint, because such a blow could have killed him. In one moment, that man was already lying on the floor from the boy's strong blow. While he was getting up and the others were standing ready to attack the boy, he decided to ask who they were and wondered if they were robbers. Suddenly their leader shouted to the others to rush to kill him, and not stand in one city because they had to do it at once. The young man realized that the fight was inevitable, so he decided not to spend all his strength on them, because he did not want to fight. After a while, he was already sitting on a pebble, and the men who wanted to attack him were all on the ground. The young man thought for a moment that if he had a normal weapon, but then he realized that the end would be the same. Suddenly their heads started to rise and said that the boy was actually right because only real monsters came to their hideout. The young man was surprised that he called him a monster and decided to ask the details of this, to which the man quietly replied that not so long ago such people came to them and took everything. Then the man pointed out that those monsters were the same Koba as he was. The guy sat down more comfortably and asked him to tell more details about those monsters that came and took everything away. But the man suddenly answered with a slight smile that if the young man won him in battle, he would immediately start obeying him. Suddenly, the man understood in what direction he would start acting. Since he had nothing to lose, he decided that he would not tell such information for free, and this much he understood. It was quite valuable information for that boy. Suddenly, getting up, the young man understood what he wanted and answered that he had something to lose. So he decided to get such information out of the man because he understood so much, otherwise it wouldn't have worked out. Approaching the man who was on his knees unable to get up, the boy said that he would turn the whole city upside down because they still could not defeat him by force, even by the force of the whole city. But for information that was valuable to him, he would agree to leave without touching anyone else. Suddenly another robber, who was still lying on the floor, replied that if their head did not say anything, he would gladly tell, because he remembered one of them quite well because he had a scary look, which made their head very angry. They decided to ask the boy whether he would definitely leave their city for the information he could tell Sunbei, who promised the following in response. Suddenly the head replied that Koba did not change into the form of a titan even after that he went west. When the young man asked what happened at the event, the man nervously replied that he didn't know anything, so he asked you to leave their place as soon as possible. Suddenly, the young man thought carefully about who it could be who would not change the form of the titan in battle. Then the young man decided to demand that the man take him to the warehouse. The man could not understand what was the matter because for some reason he should take him to the warehouse as if he were his personal driver. Suddenly, the man became very angry because from the beginning the young man promised completely different conditions, but in response the young man replied that they were robbers and stole everything anyway. But suddenly the boy hurried to calm the man because he needed only one thing. The girls at that time tried to find something useful, but they realized that there was only garbage and nothing else. Nothing suitable and interesting for them. But suddenly the girl found a drink and decided to tell her older friend why and replied that she was very pleased because they really needed it. But in a moment, the girl saw Sunbi in the distance who was approaching them and was glad that everything was fine with him, who in his answer asked why they got out of the car because it was quite dangerous. Lua replied that they were trying to find something nearby that could be useful to them at any time and Cindry asked what he could be doing that was taking so long. Suddenly, the guy replied that he had received information and needed to get ready to go on the road. The girls were surprised and even a little angry because they agreed on such a plan that they would stay in that city to rest for a while. Sunbei reached for the handle of the car to open it and sit in the middle and replied that their plans had changed because it was quite dangerous to stay there especially for the night. Then the boy returned to them and answered that he would tell everything on the way, what happened to him and how he found the information and why it was so dangerous there. Driving the car, the guy told the whole story, while it was already night outside and the dawn was shining clearly, so the girl was surprised that there were robbers who told such information, so she was not sure that the information was accurate. Then the young man answered that even when he took the form of a titan, it was not easy to overcome such robbers, but as for ordinary cobs, it was not easy at all. Continuing his journey, the boy continued his story by the fact that he overcame so many robbers in plain clothes and decided that this really needed to be checked. Cindry was surprised, because it is strange that the boy decided to act like that only because of that information. There must have been something else that motivated him. Suddenly the boy remembered the events that happened in the warehouse and remembered how they were looking for what he asked for, and when they asked why they were looking for what he needed, the young man replied that there was no need to think about it. Suddenly, the man put ice on his face and answered that even if they found what they were looking for, it is better not to play with this thing. Then the man continued that when he got angry, He froze in one city and could not even do anything. He even had such a feeling of fear as if he had been in the war a year ago. But even then it was not as strong as when he saw him. Then the others began to talk among themselves. They thought that it was exactly the weapon that everyone was talking about. But the other answered that if it was exactly that weapon, they would already be dead. After all, they were moving for killing and fun, and that was clear as day. Suddenly the young man came back from his thoughts and realized that it will not be like before because he is not a machine for killing others. Suddenly the girl who was sitting next to him realized that something was wrong with him, and decided to ask what exactly happened. The young man came to his senses even better, finally leaving his thoughts. Continuing on his way, the young man replied that he was simply immersed in his thoughts. But the girl was surprised by these answers, because he could not simply immerse himself in his thoughts in the middle of a conversation. Suddenly, when the girl turned to look at the back seats of the car, she saw that the girl was sleeping soundly, and her sleep became much better. She told this to her friend and he was happy with the news. Cindry reported that it was quite difficult for her to live after the day when she was injured, that Marco died in front of her eyes and she constantly had terrible dreams. But then she was better. The guy seemed surprised because she was injured, but on the other hand it was understandable. Suddenly he handed the girl objects, and told her to give them to her, when the girl in a dream inexplicably reached out her hand and asked what it was. The girl looked at the boy in surprise, and he answered that it was something that was added to the food that he got from those robbers. She asked if there was nothing similar for her, but the guy replied that he only asked those robbers for one, which made the girl very offended because he didn't think about her. Meanwhile, in Stilla, in a city that did not belong to anyone, people appeared and it became much livelier than it used to be. A man who watched the children running happily was pleased that they had brought more people from that city. Suddenly, the boy asked his friend Colt how many soldiers there were in that city. Why, he answered that there were 40 people, not counting those who were outside the city. Because that young man replied that his friend should invite more to the city because it was too little. Instead, the young man was surprised because he thought that something had happened. The man replied that since his eyes do not see, he relies on his intuition in most cases, and in most cases it has never suited him. Then he added that he felt a very strange air flow from the east. Suddenly, when he removed captor and glasses, it became clear that it was a girl with long straight hair. Then she answered that she felt such a strange feeling exactly 3 years ago. It was Despera, who was a former weapon of Genesis. At that time, they were already staying overnight and sleeping in tents, and suddenly they did not notice how morning had come. Cindry suddenly woke up and decided to look out of the tent and realized that Lua was already sitting on a chair near their table, so she decided to ask if she was cold. Noticing Cindry, Lua was very happy because she didn't have to sit alone now. Cindry started to approach the table and Lua decided to ask her if she wanted cocoa, to which the girls happily agreed and replied that a cup of cocoa wouldn't bother them. Cindry asked the girl if Sunby was still asleep, and she replied that she had not yet seen him leave his tent. Cindry realized that he must have been asleep for a long time, and she decided to wake him up and headed to his tent with a cup of cocoa in her hand. When the girl rejected the tent, she was frightened and surprised at what she saw, because in front of her was Odie, who was in the form of a titan and was pulling out a core from himself. She entered the tent completely and decided to inquire what he was doing, but the young man was a little surprised because she came in suddenly, and then asked if she really saw the core for the first time. Sunbay decided to check it, because after the fight with Elent, the initial strength was surprisingly less, and a strange girl with fear in her eyes asked if it was a good thing that he opened it on his own. Examining his core, the young man replied that of course everything was fine because it was his body and there was nothing strange or terrible about it. The girl said that although he looked like a person, he was completely different. Then the girl asked if everything was fine, to which the young man replied that it looked quite good from the outside, but he still could not understand the reason for his weakness. Then the young man assumed that it was possible that everything was due to the fact that a few days ago his core went into overload mode. The girl decided to ask if he had not observed such changes before, but the young man answered that there had never been such a thing before. This had happened for the first time since the war. The girl asked what he felt, and the young man replied that there was one more thing that bothered him quite a bit. The grandson replied that since he started having problems with the core, he stopped having that strange dream that he had every day before. The girl decided to ask about the dream that he could not remember, and decided to assume that that dream could not be related to his core. After getting dressed and putting on his coat, the boy replied that he couldn't know because he needed to learn more about it, so he had to go to Lua because she was already waiting for them. When they went outside, the girl said that in any case, if they found the city, it was necessary to conduct a rather detailed inspection of it. He agreed with that. At that time, in the city of Dasfin, which also did not belong to anyone, a ship arrived that was as if no one could enter it. People were quite alert and looked to see who was coming out. It was Elend with his army. But people didn't know that, so they stopped to see someone and ask others. Suddenly, the young man, it would seem, greeted everyone politely and said that they had come to them in order to ask one question. They showed the projection to the people and answered that they were looking for the man Cobb and the human girl and asked if any of them had ever seen them. Suddenly the local residents looked at each other and realized that they had never seen them and did not know who they were because they had seen them on that projection for the first time. Suddenly, their mayor came to his people and told him that strangers had come to look for those who were depicted in front of them. Elend politely shook his hand to meet them and replied that he was very happy to meet him and asked if he was the local mayor, then asked them to understand because they could not give a more detailed description of those people. Suddenly, the mayor noticed an inscription on the chest of Elend's uniform M3. Then the man raised his eyes and looked at them from under his forehead and answered that he had never seen them and that the people of Tristan were just disgusting to him, so he ordered them to get out of his city. But suddenly the man could not understand what happened as Elend's guards hit the man with a weapon and sold his blood on the ground. Suddenly, the people standing behind were surprised and shocked because what they saw in front of them was no joke. But suddenly Elend got angry with his bodyguard and asked what he did and why. And he replied that the man just said something stupid. But suddenly he replied that if they did not have them, it did not mean that they had to be expelled from their city. Therefore, since their garden was not too big, he offered to finish it faster. But suddenly he apologized to the people who were on the ground near the mayor, and said that he did not want this. Then he said that they would conduct a search to find out what really appeared there, and if they agreed to cooperate with them they could stay alive. A few moments later, they flew off to another city. Steering his ship, he asked his guards what they found as a result of the search. The guard replied that they didn't find them in that city either, and then the man asked them if there wasn't another way to find them directly. But suddenly one of the guards answered that many cities that did not belong to anyone did not have the proper communication infrastructure, so it took a little more time to access the cameras or computers. This information made Elend even more angry, and then, looking at the map, he wondered where Odie could actually be hiding. Other fighters who were sitting in the city for luggage were fastened with safety belts, and were sitting under the walls. One of them, whose name was Tardo, was giving himself an injection. One of them spoke to him opposite, and said that his thoughts were foggy because he was taking those drugs almost every hour. Then he decided to ask him for one favor so that next time he would think better with his head and not act too hastily. That was Tordo. Tardo, in turn, replied to him that he should not come to him with his advice, because the only pleasure he received was murder and drugs. Tordo looked at him, and replied that he was just pathetic, and reminded him that the mission was not just fun killings. Holding the empty bottle from the injection, he squeezed it, and answered that he knew it very well, and then it crunched and broke. But Tardo then asked if it was okay to kill people who weren't their target. Meanwhile Odie, Lua and Cindry were still on the road. The girl opened the map and her notes, and realized that they had been on the road for 2 days without interruption since they left those ruins. Suddenly the girl looked at the back seat of the car. You asked the girl if you saw anything, how she felt. The girl sat buckled up and used her powers to sense if there was anyone around them that they couldn't see. Suddenly, she shouted in a joyful voice that she had found, thereby scaring the boy. He decided to suddenly ask who you were and where. The girl said that if they drove straight without turning the road, they could get to the city that survived. Cindry praised her and thanked her. So Sunbei decided with a smile on his face, and said that it was necessary to go sooner. In the meantime, they already accelerated and reached the first checkpoint. There were hooded people standing there, and they were all dressed the same and holding weapons in their hands. One of them ordered them to stop for a while. Suddenly one of them answered the young man who was driving that it was a garden that did not belong to anyone and was called Still. Then he asked the young man to tell where they came from and what was the purpose of their trip. Suddenly the young man replied that they had come from the ruins where they were being chased by robbers, so they wanted to repair their car and rest there for a day, and asked if that would be a problem. Suddenly, the girl who was holding a tablet with a stylus in her hand started checking the information and was alarmed by the fact that he was with two people, so she said that if they needed help, they could safely contact the security guard who was in the center of the city. When they finally went to the city, the young man said that their goods were lying around much less than he could have thought. This was probably due to the fact that they told them why they came to their city, namely from bandits. An hour had already passed since they had gone to the city. Time passed quickly enough, and they still had to find a house where they could stop to repair the car, so their business was very busy. Suddenly, the girl sitting behind was happy because they could finally swim in clean water. Then Cindry added that they would finally have a soft bed and delicious food. But suddenly the young man decided to interrupt them to say that they came for serious business and not to have fun, but the girls decided to use such a privilege if it existed. Suddenly, when they found themselves near the hotel in which they were supposed to rest, they realized that they would not see any beds and delicious food, because in front of them was not a hotel, but rather a prison. Using her abilities, the girl answered that there was only one hotel in that place. But the young man answered that they wanted a lot because they traveled by car. Then he decided to ask the girls not to behave like outsiders because they could be treated badly there. When the young man opened the door, there was an empty room in front of him, and dust flying in the air. It seemed that the hotel had been abandoned and was not working. Cindry suddenly wondered if they were actually working, because it was too empty for a hotel. The girl noticed that it was very tasty. It smelled like food. Suddenly they heard other voices approaching them, and it was clear that those people were happy to have new visitors. Suddenly, the grandfather who came out had a gray mustache and gray short-cut hair, and he was dressed in an administrator's uniform. He politely folded his hands and asked if there were 3 of them. Suddenly, the grandfather took a closer look at his visitors and decided to ask if one of their guests was Koba. The young man replied that it was actually so, and with a serious birch closer asked if it was a problem for them. Suddenly, the grandfather asked if they were outsiders, which really surprised those visitors, because if they were not outsiders, they lived in that city and did not use the services of their hotel. But suddenly it scared the girl pretty good. She wanted to ask how you knew, but her friend stopped her from doing it by covering her with her hand. Suddenly, the grandfather answered with a smile that he just saw their faces for the first time. Moreover, local residents did not stay in their hotel so often, which was not surprising. Suddenly, the girls remembered the words of the young man who told them before entering the hotel not to show that they were outsiders, so they were surprised that the grandfather understood this. Suddenly, the boy asked if outsiders could stay in their hotel. Why did the grandfather answer that of course, because he did not choose his visitors and guests. Suddenly, he put the card that was included from their room on the table and answered that their room was 202 and dinner started at 6 o'clock in the evening. Since they were guests of this hotel, dinner was free for them, so they could eat whatever they wanted. Sunbae gave the key card to the girl and answered that they should go up to their room and he wanted to park the car in the right city. The girls went up to their room and for Lua it was quite an interesting and unusual experience. Suddenly, the boy did not go to park the car and decided to ask one question of the administrator, grandfather, who was standing with his back to them sorting their papers. Listened to him carefully. He asked the grandfather whether if someone was looking for them, he would not have told them that they were staying at his hotel, so he could double the price for staying at the hotel. Suddenly, grandfather administrator assumed that they came across bad guys in those ruins, and told them not to be accepted because the fighters of that city were very strong. The young man decided to ask if he meant the guards who guarded the entrance to the city. Grandfather confirmed this and answered that they were protecting their city from robbers. Besides, they were also rescuing people who were left in those ruins. In addition, their leader was the only Koba in Stilio, so it was not so important who exactly their opponent was. If he made a noise, he would be immediately expelled. Suddenly we caught hold of his words and asked if this grandfather knew what he might look like or his name, but he replied that he had never seen him. When the young man was about to leave, the grandfather added that he had heard that he had not returned from the expedition a few days ago, so he needed to look for him on his own, but he did not know whether people were telling other people any details about him or not. When the boy entered their room, he saw that the girls had already taken their beds and were lying down to rest, Suddenly Cindry answered that it was much better there than she could have thought. While resting on her bed, she also noted that the cotton blankets were just perfect. Meanwhile, the young man decided to check if there were devices that could listen to them in their room with the help of his special device. Suddenly, hiding his device, he told the girls to have dinner together. Why did the girl ask if he really didn't want to eat? He replied that he needed to find some information and put on a hood. This made the girl laugh, and she decided to ask what he was doing and why. Suddenly, the girl became wary and decided to assume that it was not a disguise, but it was, after all, exactly that. But suddenly the girl decided to help with the disguise and dressed the young man as an ordinary citizen of the city, and then replied that it was much better because it looked more real. He thanked and said that he was going to leave. The girl was surprised that he decided it so quickly. She lay on the bed and watched him go to the exit of their room and suggested that they rest and then leave together. But he, without turning to her, replied that it was not necessary because he asked her to take care of the girl. She turned and lay head down on the bed and asked the boy to walk less alone. Suddenly, the girl came out of the room and asked where the boy had gone, and the other answered that he had gone to collect the information they needed. Cindry told Lua that he asked them to go to dinner together, but the girl was surprised and asked why he wouldn't go. She continued to talk about the boy because she understood that he must be very tired from driving the car all the time and he needed to eat and rest a little. But this made the girl angry, and she replied that she did not know what was wrong with him. It was already evening and it was necessary to go to dinner, so the girls decided to take advantage of this opportunity. When they went down to the first floor, they were surprised by what they saw. A large dining room with tables opened in front of them, and then they realized that it was a basement, and in the basement there was a restaurant of such large sizes. She still had so much that her eyes ran out of what she could try. She was also very tasty, and the girls with a big appetite ate everything that was in front of them. Suddenly, a cook appeared in front of them and asked how their food was, because it was the main dish of their hotel, and the cook was the same grandfather, the administrator. The girls, tasting the dishes, replied that it was simply unsurpassed and added that they actually ate such delicious food for the first time. The cook was very happy to hear such a compliment. Then he added that in addition to dishes, their restaurant also had drinks, so local residents visited them quite often. Suddenly the girl was surprised and said that they were the only outsiders. But suddenly, after a moment, she realized what she said out loud and was shocked that I did not understand how I revealed such a secret. Cindry asked what happened to Lua and stared at her in shock without looking away. But the cook may not have heard what they answered because he didn't seem to react in any way. But local residents who were resting and drinking their drinks at nearby tables understood and heard everything the girl said, so they were very shocked by what they heard. Cindry was suddenly very surprised when she saw people from her town and asked the cook where those people were from and why they had come there. The cook asked the girl if she was talking about the very people he was pointing at. The cook replied that they were soldiers from Trimtan, that is, from their city, and they worked in Sav outside still. They sometimes came to have fun at their place, but he saw those guys for the first time. But suddenly the cook assured the girls that there would be no problems from them, so there was no need to worry. But the man's look was not comforting at all. When the girls looked at that man, they realized that they were indeed in trouble. The girls understood that they had to leave and told the cook that they had already eaten and needed to go. But the cook who was standing by their table noticed that they still had a lot of food left and suggested that he could pack it with him. Suddenly, a man appeared behind the little cook. He was many times bigger than him, and when he approached, he turned to the girl and said that he had been looking at her for a long time. When the man came closer, he said that the girl from close was even more beautiful. He leaned over to the girl there with a smile on his face, kept a lit cigarette, and answered that he was transferred there not so long ago. But he saw her for the first time. Then he offered to have a drink with him and for her to tell him about the place in more detail. When he shifted his gaze to Lua, he scowled. I thought that she should be sent home to be alone with Cindry. Suddenly, as strange as it was, the girl breathed a sigh of relief and thought that they probably hadn't been told anything about Tristan yet. Suddenly Cindry looked up at him and told the man that it was terrible for him to die with cigarettes and booze, and then with a smile on his face, suggested that he get attached to someone else. The man smoked a cigarette, and he did not like the girl's answer at all, so he got angry. Suddenly, the cook who was standing next to him asked the man to put out his cigarette because in their restaurant it was not allowed to water because it disturbed other visitors. so he apologized politely, and asked to return to his seat. Suddenly, the man suddenly hit the cook and pulled him to him. He asked what you could do to him because he did not see the law that said that he was forbidden to smoke in that place. Holding this poor cook grandfather and not letting him go, he said that no one could manage him because they were the ones who settled this city. The man did not stop and continued to say that he was already disgusted by the fact that he was sent to that dump, as he called it. But he decided to come right there to their restaurant to spend his money because he felt sorry for them. Suddenly, the young man who was sitting at a distance and was in a hood watched the scene, and the last words made him angrier. Suddenly, one of the wards of that man answered in a polite tone that he, that is, his captain, was drunk and offered to return, because next time he would not be allowed in that institution. Suddenly he threw the cook so that he flew away and fell on his back. The cook beat himself up nicely and the girl, holding his head, ran to him and asked if he was all right, because she was afraid for him. Suddenly the man replied that he didn't want to drink anymore, so he could leave. They all got together and left the restaurant. Cindry sat next to the cook and held him, then looked away and looked after the man and was shocked at what kind of fool he was doing there. Suddenly, a man who was nearby at the table and was watching this carefully looked at the man who had left. Suddenly, the girl apologized to the chef, because everything was for her as she thought, but he replied that everything was fine with him and replied that the man probably did not know their laws, because in their city it was not allowed to behave like that. In the meantime, those men went outside when it was already dark. The man lit a cigarette again and started smoking as his ward said that it is better not to make noise in that place. But suddenly the captain did not like it, and he asked if he was trying to teach him. Suddenly the soldier objected. He did not want to teach him, and replied that this garden belonged to other people and there were volunteers who were responsible for security. But the man is prudent, and he replied that they were only voluntary people and what they could do to him. Then he added that he was even interested in shooting anyone, he said with a smile as they approached the other car. Suddenly he heard another voice that said that even on the street his drunken concerts and clumsy behavior did not fit into any boundaries. The man could not understand who and where that voice came from. Suddenly, when he raised his head, he saw a hooded man on the roof of a small house, and he replied that he followed that man because he was worried that he could still do something and added that he was not mistaken. The young man decided to add that he was like all other people from his country, they did not value human life at all. At that moment, he saw how the man became even more serious. Suddenly that man started approaching his house and called his soldiers and asked who he was. Suddenly, one of his soldiers replied that the boy was in that restaurant, which prompted the man to ask if the owner of that restaurant had sent him for him. Suddenly, the young man looked even lower at the man and answered that as long as he did not do anything, he was ready to let him go, but the condition was that he would never come to that place again. Suddenly this amused the man and he could not understand what kind of fool was so brave. He turned to his soldiers and asked with a smile if all the local residents had a bad headache. Suddenly, holding a weapon in his hand, the man asked if he was a voluntary person, a voluntary guard who guarded that place, because he was quite interested. Suddenly he pulled out a gun and pointed it at the young man, and said that we will see what he was capable of. He also added that the young man should go downstairs and talk to him downstairs. The young man who was in a mask and hood answered that in a city that does not belong to anyone, he must follow the rules that were established there. Then he decided to ask if Tristan's laws had their force there. Suddenly, his soldier, who was behind the man, suggested that they just go back. But the man replied that he had no pride because they were attracted by Telepen, which would not even exist of his country. Suddenly the young man jumped from the roof of the house and landed on his feet right in front of the man. He said that one of the rules of his town was that it was forbidden to use unauthorized weapons. Suddenly, those words angered the man even more and he grinned, showing his teeth. Suddenly he opened fire and started shooting at the young man and shouted what could be the laws or regulations in that dump. But the young man had no problem reacting quickly and running away from his shot. In a moment, the young man threw his weapon at the man with an ace knife and kissed the man on the shoulder. He flew away and threw the weapon. Suddenly, when the man was falling, his blood splattered in different directions, until the young man pounced on him from above and decided to literally trample him. He stepped on the wound he had just made and the man screamed and cried out in pain. The man was lying on the floor and howled in excruciating pain, while he stood over him, and on his wound. Suddenly the man ordered his guards to stand still and help him. Suddenly, the young man looked away from the man at his soldiers and said that if the rules were violated, the punishment would be expulsion, and recommended that the soldiers not interfere in the matter. The man was lying on the floor there, screaming in pain, and then asked if he thought that nothing would happen to him because his country could immediately snatch the place of that young man. To which the young man replied, what was important to Tristan was only Cobb Underground and not the miserable life of that man, let alone the captain. Suddenly, the man realized what would happen to him and began to be a little afraid of that young man who stood in front of him, and did not leave his body and wounds. The young man asked if the man understood everything, then ordered him to immediately flee from that city and never return there. When the young man approached the window, the man asked if he was really the leader of the volunteer group. Suddenly the man replied that he only knew that the boy was Koba and that the young man always wore a hood when he walked around the city. So he replied that thanks to that boy they could live in peace without anyone touching them, and suddenly the man asked Sunbei, who asked if he would like to join him. Then the boy asked the man what these volunteers were doing. The man answered that they were protecting the city and, in addition, rescuing refugees and establishing cities. Suddenly, a girl who overheard their conversation replied that she was also a refugee a year ago, so before that a few days ago they brought new ones to the city. So the girl assumed that he probably didn't come with them, just like Odie, and confirmed. Suddenly she replied that she did not know much about their leader, and it would not be faster to find out all the details from the volunteers themselves because they were easy to find because they always wore the same clothes. The boy listened carefully and remembered this information because it was very useful for him. When I realized that it was already dark outside and I needed to go, he thanked me for the information and said that he needed to go when the girl asked if he was so grateful that he could buy something from her shop. But suddenly one of the volunteers heard this conversation and stood behind the stone wall eavesdropping on them. A few minutes passed and the boy returned to the hotel. When he entered his room, he knew that the girls were waiting for him there and asked if anything had happened while taking off his glasses. But suddenly he heard a scream that something had happened, and the next thing that happened was how Cindry kicked him in the stomach from running, so he flew away from the door and crashed into the wall. When the young man held on to the place where the girl was kicked, he looked at her, and could not understand what had happened to her. But she stood in a fighting position and said why he was pretending because he was not in pain anyway. But after a few minutes, when they sat down and the girl told the whole situation, the guy was very surprised because there were people from Tristan in the hotel. The girl continued to tell them that the cook told them that they came there quite often because they were from Tsav and were out of town, so she was very happy because no information had reached them yet. The young man realized that they almost fell into a trap, but thank God everything went well, so he suddenly decided to ask if they were not injured. But the girl was shocked that only then he asked everything and answered that thanks to the hotel owner, they were whole. So the girl replied that they were lucky that time, but it could be very dangerous to stay there for a long time. At that time, she hugged the girl who was sitting next to her. Suddenly, the young man admitted that he did not think about what might happen, because who could have known that Salve was somewhere nearby. Suddenly, the girl became even more angry because she offered the boy to go with him, but they stayed alone. The young man covered his face with his hand and asked for forgiveness. Then the wreath added that next time they would go together because it was much safer. The girl decided to find out what information he had found. The guy began to tell that he learned about the volunteers who defended the city, and decided to ask if they had seen them in the restaurant. Suddenly, the girl asked Lua if she had seen anything similar, but Lua replied that she had not seen anyone. Then, having missed it, surely the one who attacked those thieves in the ruins was exactly that volunteer. Then he assumed that the local residents probably believed them because they contributed a lot to the development of the city, and they also said that no one knew their names or what they looked like, because the volunteers were always wearing hoods. So the girl assumed that they were hiding on purpose and then decided to ask an interesting question why they were operating outside the city. The young man was also interested in this because no one knew this reason, so it was pointless to find any information because it was better to ask their leader directly. Meanwhile, at the factory on the outskirts of Still, in the shelter of the volunteers, two young men sat warming themselves by the fire and one asked what suddenly happened. The other assumed that something might have happened because he was told that everyone, even those who were sent on a mission, had been ordered to return. Suddenly, another guy came to them and asked what they should do if they complained about such little things. Suddenly, the young men standing by the fire realized that a substitute had come. He asked if their head commander was inside, to which the boys confirmed that he was there with other leaders. Suddenly, Colt, who was the deputy commander, entered his office and with honor put his hand on his chest and answered what was required of him. Suddenly he heard a voice that allowed him to enter the office. When the young man entered the office, he saw that there were already people standing there, a girl and 3 other guys. Suddenly, the young man asked his friend Alidon what he was doing there because not so long ago he was sent to Daspan. Then he assumed that he returned because there was such an order, to which Alidon replied that everything was not quite like that. But suddenly the girl who was listening to them replied that it is probably necessary to postpone the happy moments of the reunion for later. The girl began to tell that since everyone came, she decided to tell why she took them all in one city. The girl covered her head and answered with sadness on her face that Daspan was attacked by scoundrels from Tristan. Suddenly, all the boys who were listening to her were very surprised by this, and could not believe what they heard. Suddenly one of them asked if the people who lived in that city were all right. Suddenly, the girl asked Alidon, who was there on a mission, to tell everything in more detail. The man began to tell that the mayor and several local residents had died, so he immediately arrived there as soon as the situation in the city became more or less stable. But they could not understand what was the reason. Maybe the locals did something to Tsava, who was nearby. Suddenly the guy answered that they were looking for people, namely 1 cob and 1 human girl. Another who was standing nearby replied that there was no cob in Daspan but they attacked and killed anyway. So their general girl answered that they will search around and so that no one interferes with them, because they still did not value human life at all from cities that did not belong to anyone. Those scumbags from Tristan had no business with them as long as they could calmly mine cob. But it was the first act of pure aggression after the end of the war, and it made the girl even more angry. So the girl decided that something had to be done, because if they went to that city, they would do everything in the past, so they had to stop them as soon as possible. But one of the young men assumed that they had come to them in the city in any case because it was a matter of time. Another said that the detachments had returned. But the girl replied that they would not fight with them. But this greatly surprised her subjects. Her plan was to find the people they were looking for, and the sooner it was the better because it was the only way to protect their city. Suddenly one of the boys asked if they would search outside the city because they were already in Stilla. Suddenly, the girl asked Beer, because he was responsible for the outskirts of the city, if he suddenly did not notice that maybe he was thinking seriously. He remembered that in the morning he heard how the very people they needed to know about came to the western gate because they were allowed to pass as they looked like refugees who had suffered from thieves. But the other couldn't believe that they were already in their city. So they decided that they needed to check because no one knew where you were exactly. But another young man approached him and asked how he could not know about such a thing, since he was responsible for the outskirts of the city abroad, and how he could be so irresponsible about his work. But the young man replied that if he had known about such a situation, he would have followed them. The young man answered that there were more and more refugees and there was a shortage of basic necessities. The other answered that they were doing everything in their power anyway. But suddenly the guy who was still in the hood asked what kind of scene they had arranged in front of their commander. Suddenly those two stopped everything. But the girl replied that everything was fine because it happened. She asked if there were any reports that they could leave the city, and the other answered that there was no such thing. No one told him anything like that. Putting her hands on her sides, the girl understood and said that they were still in their city. She did not say that everyone except the team of border guards would participate in the search for those people, because they could not know when the scoundrels from the M3 could reach their city. When the girl asked if anyone else had any information to inform everyone, one of the men standing answered that he remembered something else. When he was transporting humanitarian aid to refugees in the bazaar, he saw someone looking for information about their leader. Suddenly the girl wondered who it could be and asked the young man. He replied that he had seen that man for the first time and that he covered his face so that he could not see him. Suddenly, one of those standing in the room assumed that it was quite suspicious to cover his face. But maybe he wanted to join. But then why did he need to look for the commander himself? He was asked if he believed where that young man went. He answered that he went to a hotel located in the northern part of the city. Suddenly, the girl assumed that maybe he was hiding his face behind the scoundrels of M3. Tsav often came to the city, and if he was the one they were looking for, it made sense for him to hide his face. Suddenly, Colt asked if he had checked what species the young man belonged to, but he awkwardly replied that he had not checked. Suddenly, the girl suggested that since they did not know why they were looking for them, they could ask them about it themselves. Then she ordered to immediately go to the hotel to check there. If he was one of Cobb, it was necessary to immediately carry him to her. Suddenly, she said that it was necessary to end their meeting on that note, to which the boys agreed. After some time, Colt came to the office and said that he did everything as she ordered. He contacted other cities. He learned that the scoundrels from M3 attacked not only Desper but also other cities. But there was no confirmation that among the people from M3 there was the same weapon of Genesis. The girl answered that during the war, all the weapons went in the form of only the Titans so that none of the ordinary people could see what they looked like in their usual form. And in that city, only Colt knew that it was also that weapon. The young man with his stepfather in his eyes replied that it was not important what they wanted to do in that city. The main thing was that it was not possible to tell such a secret that only the two of them knew. If there was a Genesis weapon among those people, they would have revealed its identity under any circumstances and done everything to steal it. Suddenly the girl had a slight smile, and she asked the boy if he was really afraid that she might be lost. He was in shock and didn't know what to answer because he was embarrassed. Suddenly, when the girl turned her head to him, she answered that he should not worry, because she was not their goal, so she will not leave that city until he himself throws her out of there. At that time in Tsav, in the infirmary, they provided medical assistance to a man who was beaten by one of the volunteers. When he got up from the couch, he replied that it was all because of them, but the doctor told him to calm down because the stitches could come apart. Holding his head, which hurt unbearably, he said that he should not have ended up in that landfill and thought about applying for a transfer. Suddenly, one of that man's soldiers entered the ward and answered that they had problems. But the man replied that there was no need to touch him because he was being treated. The soldier replied that several men had arrived from Tristan, but they were not informed that they might have been checked. Suddenly this information really surprised the man, and he got a little scared. Then he asked who was on board. At that time, Ellen came out of the ship with his large army. Suddenly, a moment later, the man who was already being treated with a bandaged hand was waiting at the entrance. He greeted his master, and replied that they did not have time to prepare as they should because they were not told that he would arrive. But he replied that it was not important because they stopped at a gas station. The man replied that they would try to make his time spent there pleasant. Suddenly, one of the soldiers approached the young man who worked there and asked if he had that special thing. But the young man could not understand what exactly he was talking about. Suddenly the soldier got angry and answered directly that he was looking for exactly S. The young man was scared and finally saw what he was talking about, and answered that he had what he needed. He warned another soldier that he would leave for a moment, and Tordo also saw this and understood where he had gone, so he said that he was poor. A few minutes later, behind one of the doors, he was already injecting himself with another dose and asking about such a high concentration of the drug because he liked it. The soldier replied that no one would understand the feeling he felt because they were ordinary people and only Koba could feel such pleasure. The young man who was sitting in front of him decided to ask for what purpose they came to their city because it was definitely not because of that injection. The soldier replied that they were looking for people. The young man was very surprised by these answers. In a moment, the soldiers already showed a projection of those they were looking for, namely one cob and a human girl. He began to tell that they had already spent several days nowhere. Suddenly the young man was in shock because he realized that he had seen this girl and answered like that. Suddenly, when the soldier heard this, he pounced on the young man and ordered him to immediately tell where he had seen her. At that time, Ellen was sitting in a restaurant with his soldiers, who were not all at the table, and Tordo was also with them. Suddenly a man appeared with a wound in his hand and answered that the refueling of their ship was completed, and did he have any other violations for him, but Ellen replied that he could be free. Ellen did not have time to drink what he wanted when another voice called him. At first he did not understand what was the matter and who dared to interfere with him. Ellen sat and silently looked at the soldier who came to them and called him, and Tordo decided to ask what kind of noise he made, but he answered that it was worth listening to because he had very important information for them. The soldier replied that he was finally able to find where their target was located, namely in the anarchic city of Still, which, by the way, was not far from them. Suddenly, the soldier replied that he found out when he was injecting, and that the scoundrels had not yet seen the message in which they said that they were looking for those two people, because they liked midnight. When he approached the man who still remained near them, he asked what was said in the message when the place would not understand that they had come across exactly the target they were looking for, but the man did not know what to answer. Suddenly he said that their bad commander did nothing and at that time squeezed his hand early so that the man screamed. Holding the man by the wound on his shoulder, he asked if he even imagined how much they tried to catch those people, but the man begged for forgiveness through his cry. Suddenly Ellen asked where exactly that city was located, and the soldier replied that he was told that it was north of the place where they were mule at that moment. Suddenly their commander asked if that soldier was sure of that information, why he replied that the boy who went to the city with that man had evidence. The man said that there was a woman with orange hair with this girl, but they did not see the boy with him. Suddenly Tordo asked if it was a girl with red hair, but then he thought about it, and realized who it was. Tordo returned to his head and answered that the postcard that was sent to everyone did not include that woman, but she was exactly the one who was with Odie, so he asked Ellen whether to order the military to attack. Suddenly, the commander finally finished his glass of drink and replied that if they knew the position of their city, then they did not need to hurry, so he ordered to form a small group for pursuit of the best. But with a smile he added that time he would go with this group himself. At that time, they were all in the hotel room. The girl was reading a book, the boy was resting on the bed, sitting on the edge of the bed, and Cindry asked what their plans were for the next day. Suddenly, the man assumed that he could learn something, any information, and more, but he could not hide himself so as not to pass himself off as a local. But he did not succeed, so it seemed that talking with local residents was pointless. Suddenly the man got up and sat on the bed and answered that he plans to contact the volunteers in the open. The girl answered that next time Lua will go with them. The young man confirmed this and asked why she herself did not want to go with them, and the girl answered that she would stay to repair the car. Suddenly, while reading a book, the girl realized that she was hearing and feeling something. While the girl and the boy were thinking about where to get parts for the car to repair it, the girl decided to get out of bed and listen more carefully, and Cindry informed that she had already agreed on the parts for the car with the owner of the hotel. Cindry suddenly asked the girl what happened to her, because something was wrong, and the girl answered that at midnight she heard and felt that several men were walking. That girl looked at her with a smile and answered that it was probably the owner with visitors and assured her that she did not need to worry so much. Suddenly, several people knocked on the door of their room. Cindry was very scared, and Odie did not even move. Lua wondered who could be awake at such a late hour, while Sunbae got out of bed and quietly listened. At that time, in the main office of M3 of the city of Tristan, on the top floor, namely in the office of the general director, he himself was sitting and drinking coffee. Suddenly, he picked up an identity card and read on it that the man to whom it belonged was the deputy general director and a man of Koba, and the system had been operating since the very beginning, namely 500 years ago. It was also a symbol of the union of the forces of humans and the other race of Cobb, so it was time to change that old custom. He asked someone who was sitting across from him at a large and very long table whether it was really necessary to do this. There sat another weapon of Genesis, namely Faust, who sat silently and did not answer anything. The director decided to break the silence, and said that it was quite difficult to take him out of the city, and it was good that he was able to get rid of him while on a business trip. So he added that he, as always, never disappointed Mystic, namely the same CO. Faust quietly replied that he was only carrying out the task assigned to him and nothing more, because that is exactly what happened. CO Mystic exhaled and said that they can relax and start implementing their project, but the girl who was being experimented with ran away. Faust suddenly raised his voice and said that he heard about it from Velos, namely that Odie appeared and kidnapped that girl. Suddenly the director stood up and answered that at that time it was Ellen who was trying to correct the situation, but he was worried that he could make a mistake like a calf again. Suddenly, the weapon of Genesis suggested that he could send him on this task because it was not very difficult for him, but the director replied that everything was fine, so he was working on an alternative at that moment. Also, the director suddenly remembered that he was told that he and Odie had a connection long before they became weapons of Genesis. But Faust sat and looked at him, leaving the director without an answer, and Mystic added that if he wanted, he could go and just meet him. Suddenly, Faust put the sword to the mystic and reminded him that he did not like jokes, but probably he simply forgot about it. Then he added to the CEO that he was not following him. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the director with a smile calmly deflected his sword with his hand and apologized, because he really forgot that Faust did not like jokes. Leaving him, he said that Faust could not follow Odie. Faust suddenly asked the mystic, who had not yet left the room, whether anyone else believed in what he said. Without turning his face to Faust, the mystic answered only that it was just their plan B. After all, he was slowly recovering in a large flask that covered the whole room with a bunch of wires and a bright blue substance that was shining and was in the flask. And that was exactly the one whom Ellen killed in a fit of rage, namely Marco, Lua's brother. At that time, everyone in the hotel room was standing quietly and carefully watching the door, and suddenly the knocking on the door stopped for everyone. Lua could see what was outside their room, but the girl replied that she would like to, but there were no cameras on the north side. Odie came closer to the door and decided to listen to what was outside the room. He heard two other voices arguing about whether someone was in the room or not, but the other answered that the manager answered that those people did not leave the room. Cindry suddenly decided to assume that M3 really found them, but Sunbi asked for silence so that he could better hear what was going on there. Suddenly he decided to sharply open the door and saw two volunteers in front of him. In a fit of anger, Sunbei grabbed the one who was standing closer to him by the collar and pulled him to him. But unexpectedly for everyone else, he was dragged into the room by his friends who were standing nearby and got scared. Holding the boy by the door from the other side, he asked who he was and assumed that he could be another M3 puppet. But suddenly the guy asked to let him go first, and then he saw how two girls came out of the corner. Namely, he recognized Lua, who had a beautiful and memorable appearance. Suddenly, the thought that came to the young man was correct, because he thought that it was exactly the man and girl that everyone was looking for, especially M3. Suddenly, the boy insisted that he answer faster, but he answered that he could do to him. Suddenly, he heard his friends outside the door asking if he was all right, and he replied that he was all right and ordered to stay in the city. Suddenly, he replied that he was not their puppet, but one of the leaders of volunteers in their city. Suddenly, the young man asked again if he was one of the volunteers because he thought he had heard wrong the first time. Cindry suddenly added that it seemed to her that the volunteer whom she saw in the morning was dressed the same as the one in front of her. Suddenly the guy let him go and asked why he came. Maybe he came because of what happened in the restaurant. The guy was trying to catch his breath and couldn't understand which cafe he was talking about, and whether he hadn't been there and didn't know anything about it. Then the boy asked why he came then because they had not done anything bad in that city. The boy replied that he did not come there to interrogate him. He came to bring him to their shelter on the orders of their commander. Suddenly the boy was very surprised by this, and did not believe what he was saying. Suddenly the girl realized that it was some kind of nonsense, and answered that at the beginning they wanted to break the door if it did not open. But the young man answered that they were exaggerating the situation too much, and they did not do such bad things. Odie could not understand why they were looking for them, moreover, so late at night, because it was already very late. Suddenly, the guy tilted his head and replied that it would be better for them to find out from the commander himself. Cindry suddenly approached the boy and said that he was too suspicious because he came for people, so he must answer why he wants to take them. But the boy suddenly answered that they themselves were looking for their commander, and this surprised the boy very much because he did not tell anyone about it except the girls who were in the room with him. So it was clear that he heard it from someone else, and then decided to ask how he knew. The boy replied that he himself appeared in a rather suspicious manner, so they decided to follow him as he was too openly looking for their leader. They were very surprised because they had an extremely good disguise and the young man objected because this could not work. But the girl objected and said that her disguise was many times better than what he did at the beginning, so the guy who was standing on the threshold of their room answered that it was needed not only by them but also by others. So he reminded again that it was better to go with them. The guy suddenly asked him to wait outside their room. This surprised the girl a lot because she thought something and definitely would not agree to such a thing. In a moment they were already packing their things and the girl remembered what they said yesterday because they had agreed that they would volunteer and since everything was going well there was nothing to worry about. Cindry answered that she also thought so because the plan was discussed, but for some reason Sunbei answered them that way. Suddenly, a guy appeared behind them and answered that they had come to the city for one purpose, namely to check that the leader was a volunteer with a weapon. Since they did not know that the people who persecuted them were so close, they could not spend time in that city. Suddenly the girl answered that he was right, but suddenly she thought. The guy put on his coat and, walking to the exit, answered that she should not worry, because that time he was with them, they were not alone. At that time, the army was going to the hotel to capture those whom they had been looking for so long, and one of the soldiers asked why they should go on that trough and not on their ship. Tordo answered him that they should sneak into the city unnoticed and kidnap them. Suddenly, the soldier decided to look into the driver's cabin and ask how much longer they had to go. The driver replied that they would arrive in Still in about an hour. Suddenly he shouted at the driver to drive faster because if they didn't make it in time, it was all his fault, and suddenly he was asked to calm down. Elliot was also driving, but in a different vehicle and was looking out the window. Suddenly a thought flashed through his mind that he could not know what had happened, but he was acting quite carelessly. He was so excited about what had happened in the past that he could not think normally. Suddenly he realized that he needed one of them, so he was very determined to kill Odie and deliver the girl to his superiors to continue the experiment. Meanwhile, Odie with Lua and Cindry were already approaching the factory where the volunteers were hiding. Suddenly, someone from the second floor opened the blinds to see who was approaching them. The guy who was looking through the window told his director, namely Desper, that they were already approaching, and luckily it seemed to them that there were no big problems with that. Suddenly another person who was sitting next to the director asked if these were exactly the people M3 was looking for. The guy confirmed that it was them because he saw their faces, but added that there was someone else with them. But he didn't know who because he didn't see her in the postcards that were sent to everyone for the search. Despera suddenly replied that it didn't matter much, because if she was with them, she could also be captured. Suddenly, she asked the boy who was looking out the window if he could handle Koba alone. The young man replied that it would not be a big problem for him. Suddenly, she ordered to give a signal to Rogol Ta to capture them, but at the same time it was necessary to try not to harm people. When one of the volunteers took off his mask to carry out the order, he asked what to do with Cobb. When the two volunteers were going to go to the exit, the director replied that they could do whatever they wanted, and they agreed. Meanwhile, they were already climbing the building, but the boy was disturbed by his strange feeling. They passed by people who were sitting by the fire and warming themselves. They were also some of the volunteers, but they were wearing hoods. Suddenly the boy decided to ask if it was really their shelter, because that city was quite abandoned. Rogol replied that it was really their shelter. They started living there during the war. Then he replied that the office of their commander would be a little further away. When the other volunteers who were warming themselves by the fire heard this, they visibly began to worry. Suddenly, the device that was in everyone's pocket rang and beeped because it was a sign that the operation had to be started. But the boy could not understand why the one in front of him stopped. He asked what happened, why he did not answer, and just stood with his back to him. Cindry suddenly realized that something was happening. Something was wrong because everyone stopped and looked at them. She started to get nervous. Suddenly, she decided to call the boy so that he would notice that something had happened. When she called him, she replied that there was something wrong, because little by little people began to surround them. Suddenly, one of the volunteers jumped over the young man and landed on him, but he flew empty-handed. He flew with the sword, but Odd managed to close his hands in time, and did not let the sword cripple his arm and body. The girls also noticed this, and were shocked because they thought that they wanted to save and help them. On the contrary. At that time, the boy held the punch and the sword in his hand to buy time, and save himself because he needed a few minutes to change into the form of a titan. In a moment, the young man pushed aside the guy with the sword and covered the girls who were behind him. Suddenly he asked the volunteers what they were doing because it was not possible to meet guests like that. One of the volunteers answered that he was very sorry, but everything they did was for the protection of their city. Suddenly the young man understood and said that they had deceived them, but it was not so important because he needed their leader. But one of them replied that if he wanted to meet with their leader, then they had better surrender calmly. Suddenly, one volunteer said that the weapon against Cobb didn't work for him, so he probably wasn't Cobb. Cindry noticed that people were coming closer and closer behind her, so it was necessary to do something and act quickly. When she returned to them, she said that she felt that everything was too easy, so there was no need to follow them. Suddenly, one of the volunteers grabbed the weapon that the girl was holding to defend herself. When Cindry saw this, she became even more angry and decided to act suddenly. She hit that volunteer with all her might so that he flew away and fell. Suddenly, when that volunteer was lying on the floor and shivering, the girl got into a combat position and warned everyone not to approach, because the same thing could happen to them just now. Suddenly the young man agreed and replied that he was leaving Lua's protection to her. Suddenly, the volunteers standing in front of the boy saw what their colleagues were doing and realized that they were stupid because they had been warned not to injure those two people. Suddenly, the two volunteers who were in front of the young man began to attack him with their swords. But this did not affect the young man. But they did not give up and tried to injure him in some way. But still they realized that it did not work on him. But the young man replied that everything was fine and he could continue because it was not difficult for him to just cover himself with his hands. Suddenly the young man realized that he did not have time for them and decided to change into the form of a titan. In one short moment, he hit one of the volunteers so hard that he flew for a long time. When the friend of the volunteer who was hit, seeing him fly far away, he was already lying on the floor. He was afraid for him, and when he returned to the young man, he could not understand what it was. But he was familiar with it, namely this appearance. In front of him stood a young man in the form of a titan, and the volunteer realized that he had seen it somewhere like this before, but he could not remember where and when. Desper was sitting in her study and drinking juice. Suddenly she realized that it was too noisy outside the door and could not believe that they were fighting there. When she put the juice on the table, she thought that she had nothing to worry about, because her volunteers were one of the best. But suddenly she felt something and realized that something was wrong because her feelings and intuition never let her down. In one brief moment, she also realized that she was feeling energy waves and couldn't believe that it was exactly what she thought. Meanwhile, the young man scattered those volunteers with what looked like bowling pins. For him it was like a game. Suddenly he stood in front of them and replied that he had had enough of these games and replied that he wanted to see their commander immediately. One of the volunteers could not understand who he was, but he definitely understood that he had seen him, and he seemed very familiar to him. So he decided to tell him to walk quietly and calmly with them so that they could lead him to their leader. But it seemed that the boy did not want to do this, and then he replied that why should he trust him because he had deceived him first, so he could do the same the next time. So that volunteer said that he couldn't do anything, so he couldn't hold back anymore. Suddenly he grabbed his mask, which started to turn orange and glow. Suddenly he heard the voice of his commander, who shouted that it was enough, and managed to stop him in time. Suddenly the young man and two girls heard this voice, and they suddenly turned to see who it really was. When they turned their eyes to the balcony, they saw there a girl with long hair and wearing glasses. She answered that those energy waves, she thought that they no longer exist. She saw Odie through and saw his core that was inside him. Desper was suddenly ordered to have Volunteer Cold bring them all to her office. He could not understand what was the matter because everything suddenly changed. Suddenly she answered that he should not worry, because she knew him. This answer surprised Odie quite a lot, but he began to change into his usual form. In a moment they were already in her office. She sat down and the man was standing in front of her. She answered that she never thought that she would meet him there, because 3 years had already passed. Odd suddenly replied that he hadn't seen her for a long time. He understood who she was and replied that he was glad to see her in her right mind. She decided to ask why he was looking for her because there was some serious reason. Desper asked if he knew that she was the commander of that city, and so he answered that he did not know that and did not even expect it. He was hoping for just such an event and was looking for her. Suddenly she decided to ask why he didn't happen and what it could mean, but Cindry interrupted their conversation and Desper did not understand who she was and how she could interrupt their conversation. The girl asked if it wasn't them. These volunteers were looking for them, and besides, they started the attack without warning at all, so it's impossible. Suddenly, the director reached for her drink and answered that they had been wanted for a long time and actively by M3. This answer quite surprised the girls. They went into a state of shock and asked if they were on the same side as them. Suddenly she asked if they had not been to any other cities before entering their city. The young man answered that no, because they had only been to the ruins where they fought off robbers. Suddenly she realized why they didn't know such information and tilted her head down. She once again informed that they were wanted, and for that very reason they attacked a very large number of cities that did not belong to anyone. Quite a lot of people died. All of them were quite shocked, because they did not expect that such a large number of people would die almost due to their fault. The girls were especially impressed. Lua could not believe that such a thing could happen, because on the contrary, she wanted to protect everyone and everything so that no one could die or suffer any more after the death of her brother. So the headmistress continued and replied that it was for this reason that they wanted to deliver them directly into their hands, but before they could attack their city. Cindry suddenly screamed and asked if they could have thought that the three of them could surrender to them so quickly. Suddenly she asked why they were looking for her, because if it was some minor problem she could have grabbed them at that very moment without hesitation. Odie stood and couldn't believe what she was saying and looked at her without lowering his gaze. Suddenly, he clenched his hands into fists, and replied that he would say everything exactly as it was without hesitation. He gathered courage and strength, and replied that they wanted to destroy M3, for that they needed the power and weapons of Genesis. Desper sat silently and listened carefully to him without answering and thinking about her answer. Colt, who was standing behind her, could not believe what they were saying, because it was almost impossible, and when she answered, she was completely delusional. After all, it could mean only one thing: they wanted to declare war on Tristan, but Od replied that the thing was not about war at all. So he decided to tell the plan they came up with, and he decided to tell what the girl behind them, whose name was Lua, went through. The guy started to tell and said that they were conducting experiments on children and they all died one by one. And suddenly the director realized that he had taken the only girl who survived, and that is why they were looking for them. Suddenly, Colt realized that he was wrong and started shouting at them, while the girl stood and lowered her head, remembering everything and unpleasant things that had happened to her and her brother in the past. Odie continued that they did not know the purpose of the M3, but if they did not stop them they would continue to experiment on children. Desper suddenly replied that biological weapons that were similar to them could appear again. But the boy added that she herself knew what all this could lead to. These words made Despero think. The boy continued to say that he could not deal with them alone, so he needed strength and more, especially the Genesis weapon. Suddenly, instead of support, he heard only laughter coming from Despera. She replied that she had decided to listen to him for the sake of manners, but she thought it would be better for their city to betray him to them. After these words, she began to transform into the form of a titan, and replied that she refused him his offer.